Gifts and Galas. Chapter 22, Gifts and Galas. How are y'all liking your presents so far, Squirt? Asked Rainbow Dash as she trotted up behind Scootaloo. They're great, said Scootaloo, setting down the jar of healing balm she'd received from Twilight. The cream had been spelled with some healing magic to ease the pain of bruises and pulled muscles that the filly might accumulate over the course of her training. All the presents she'd gotten from her friends so far had been fantastic. I've got something special for you, said Rainbow, chuckling at the sight of Scootaloo's eyes lighting up. Really? What is it? Jumping to her hooves, Scootaloo's wings spread in excitement as she gaped up at her idol, waiting expectantly to see what Rainbow had for her. Check this out, said Rainbow, pulling out a thin package. Practically trembling with excitement, Scootaloo took the present from her sister's hooves and pulled the wrapping paper off. However, her excitement faded slightly when she saw that the wrapping paper concealed a plain manila envelope. Maybe it's a Wonderbolt season pass or a poster or something. Carefully, she opened the envelope and withdrew the papers within. To her disappointment, the papers turned out to be plain documents, several of which were composed of very small text that Scootaloo had trouble reading and it hurt her eyes to even try. Instead, she tried to make sense of the titles on top of the pages which, at least, were of a more sensible font size. Transfer of title, proof of ownership, insurance, mortgage paid in full, taxes. Scootaloo couldn't make heads or tails of what they were supposed to be. What the hey is this? She asked, looking up at Rainbow in confusion. Rainbow merely chuckled and ruffled Scootaloo's mane before pulling out a single sheet of paper and holding it up where she could see it. This document appeared to be more easily legible than the other ones as Scootaloo's eyes scanned over it. This document hereby certifies that ownership of the airborne property, Lot 1368, has been awarded to Scootaloo of Ponyville to be held in trust by Melon Cream until she comes of age. Once again, Scootaloo looked up at Rainbow for clarification. I still don't get it. Rainbow couldn't help but grin at Scootaloo. Remember, because they can be moved freely, cloud houses don't have addresses. Instead, they're given lot numbers to identify and locate them. That lot number just happens to belong to a certain house in Ponyville. A certain house. Scootaloo's eyes widened as she realized what Rainbow was saying. Your house. Rainbow nodded in response. Scootaloo's eyes widened further until they threatened to roll out of her head. You gave me your house. Another nod. Scootaloo couldn't believe it. She'd known that she'd probably move out of her mom's house at some point. She'd always wondered if she would end up with a ground house or if she'd be able to get a cloud house like Rainbow Dash had. Never in a million years had she imagined that she'd own Rainbow's house. But why? Listen, Squirt, said Rainbow, gently running a hoof through Scootaloo's mane. Reaching out with her wing, Rainbow pulled the filly up against her side. I know this is gonna be tough to accept, but I'm gonna be leaving Ponyville in the spring. As soon as winter wrap-up's done, I'm gonna be transferring to Cloudsdale to stay at the Wonderbolt headquarters. Oh, that's right, thought Scootaloo, her heart growing heavy. She realized that she should have figured that out sooner. Of course Rainbow would have to leave Ponyville. The Wonderbolts certainly didn't stay there and Rainbow was one of them now. It was inevitable that she'd be leaving the town behind at some point. When I leave for Cloudsdale, I'm not gonna need my house anymore, said Rainbow. That's why I want you to have it. When you're old enough to move out of your mom's place, that house is gonna be waiting for you. It's been completely paid off and everything. Part of my earnings as a Wonderbolt are gonna go towards paying the taxes on that place for the next 10 years. Scootaloo couldn't help it. For the second time that day, she felt tears building up behind her eyes as her nose began to clog. She sniffed hard. She wasn't entirely sure if she was crying in happiness or sadness. Most likely, it was both. After all, she was sad that Rainbow would be leaving. But, at the same time, she couldn't help but be overjoyed at the gift she was receiving in exchange. I promise to visit as often as I can, said Rainbow. In an uncharacteristic gesture, she leaned down to plant a soft kiss on Scootaloo's forehead. No matter what, you're still my favorite and most awesome little sister in the whole wide world, and I promise that, no matter what, I'll never leave you hanging. Scootaloo was fighting hard to keep from bawling now. She didn't want to break down crying twice in one day. Seeing how hard she was trying to keep from crying, Rainbow thought of a way to turn things around. Can I ask you one favor though, Squirt? Wah, what is it? Asked Scootaloo, now turning up to look Rainbow in the eyes again. Rainbow grinned sheepishly down at her. Well, now that you're technically, the owner of my house, is it okay if I'm still living there for a couple more months, until spring comes and I have to move out? Scootaloo couldn't help it. Her sniffs and sobs were replaced by giggles and then by laughter as she hugged Rainbow tightly. Of course you can. In fact, no matter what, you're always allowed to stay there whenever you're in Ponyville. Rainbow grinned mischievously down at the filly. Careful there, Squirt, I may just take you up on that. Off to one side, Melon smiled and wiped away a tear that had gathered at the corner of her eye as she watched her daughter and Rainbow chatting animatedly. My little girl is growing up so fast. Fluttershy and Caramel leaned against each other in quiet bliss as they watched Don opening another one of his presents. Neither of them had felt compelled to open their own just yet. The sight of the colt enjoying the first real hearts-warming day of his life was a much better present than either of them could have thought to ask for. As the two of them watched, Don was slowly approached by Scootaloo, who was carrying a wrapped box under one of her wings. Don, said Scootaloo, prompting the colt to look up at the sound of her voice, I got this for you. She presented him with the box. It was flat and broad. Pulling up the wrapping paper, Don saw that it was a framed picture. Looking at it, he smiled warmly at the memory the picture contained. It was a picture of him and Scootaloo, him in his suit and her in her dress, taken on the night that they had gone to the Harvest Festival together, their first official date. Your room's too boring, said Scootaloo in a vaguely teasing tone. You need some decorations in there. I thought this would be a good start. It is, said Don, the first of many, I hope. Scootaloo nodded and quickly darted in to steal a kiss from Don. The ebony colt quickly went to the rapidly dwindling pile under the tree and pulled out a box of his own, which he hooved over to Scootaloo. The box was small, easily resting on top of Scootaloo's outstretched hoof. She quickly pulled the wrapping paper off. A sharp gasp escaped her throat as she opened the box, the light coming in from outside catching on the violet facets of the cut amethyst suspended within the small, silver pendant. It's beautiful, whispered Scootaloo. Don used his primaries to lift the piece of jewelry out of the box and loop the chain around Scootaloo's neck, fastening the clasp so that it hung freely. How does it look? Asked Scootaloo, blushing shyly as Don looked at her. Perfect, replied Don with a happy smile as he leaned in for a longer, slower kiss. The two of them parted at the sound of Fluttershy's giddy giggles. Looking over, Dawn saw that his parents hadn't moved from their original spots, both of them watching him with contented looks on their faces. Realizing something, Dawn dove once again into the pile of presents and came out with two, which he carried over to Caramel and Fluttershy, presenting them with their respective gifts. These are from me, he explained. Grandpa was a big help in getting yours, Mom. Fluttershy carefully unwrapped her long, narrow box. As she lifted up the lid, she inhaled sharply before carefully, almost reverently, lifting out the object within. It was a single, large feather, bright green in color, but with blue and purple highlights that seemed to move across its surface in ripples as she tilted it to catch the light from different angles. It was faint, but Fluttershy fancied that she could feel a faint tingle of magic from the plume. Is this a Kotal feather? Dawn nodded. Grandpa managed to locate some traders who carried one. He even got a reasonable price for it. Apparently, trading in Kotal feathers, which were considered a token of good fortune by many ponies, was a brisk trade, particularly in the southern areas of Equestria. Fortunately, poaching such creatures was more or less impossible, since they could be as dangerous as any dragon when roused, even for the young ones. It's beautiful, said Fluttershy as she set the feather back in its box. Thank you so much. Leaning down, she nuzzled Dawn fondly before they both turned to watch Caramel open his own present. The tan stallion removed the wrapping paper and opened the box to reveal a thick binder. Flipping through the binder, Caramel's eyes widened as they swept across a variety of recipes for different candies and confections. Arkenstone, Red River, and Stormfront helped me to put those together, explained Dawn. Those are recipes from the eastern nations, like Saddle Arabia and Guaxia. This is amazing, said Caramel. I can't wait to try my hoof at making some of these. I'll bet some of these treats would be a big hit at the shop. He closed the book and wrapped the colt in a hug. Thank you, Dawn. Dawn merely smiled as he enjoyed the stallion's embrace. Here, said Twilight, levitating a box over to Trixie, this is for you. For me, gasped Trixie, taking the box in her hooves and staring down at it. Twilight nodded and gave the other mare an encouraging smile. Rarity and I both helped to make it. Your brother was actually the one who commissioned it though. Oh, Trixie blinked and looked sidelong at Arcana, who feigned indifference. Pulling off the wrapping paper, Trixie opened the box and looked inside. Her jaw dropped as her eyes caught the familiar sight of purple fabric, studded with glittering stars. It's. She lifted her new cape out from the box and examined it more closely. If anything, it was even better than her old one. The stars glittered like they were made from gems that had been sewn into the fabric, while the purple shimmered under the light. It's amazing, she said. She quickly pulled the cape around herself so that it draped across her back. Looking into the box again, Trixie saw that they had also made her a new hat. With a happy sigh, she lifted it onto her head. This is wonderful. I only wish I still had my magic right now. Then I could put on a show. I'm sure you will once you finish your training, said Twilight. These articles feel so much more luxurious than my last ones, said Trixie, spinning about and watching her cape billow with emotion. What on earth did Rarity make it from? It's actually a new fabric she and I have been working on, explained Twilight. We call it shimmer silk. Yours is actually the first piece of clothing that Rarity's made with it. Really? Gasped Trixie. Twilight nodded. There's something else too, she said. Lowering her horn, Twilight leveled it at Trixie and fired a burst of magic. The beam of magical energy struck the cape, creating an aura that spread out to reach Trixie's hat as well. The two pieces of clothing began to stretch and warp. Then, with a flash, they transformed. Suddenly, Trixie found herself clad in a stunning evening gown decorated with the same glittering stars that had been on her cape and hat. It transforms, gasped Trixie, taking a new look at herself. That's amazing. Twilight couldn't help but grin in triumph. Shimmer silk had actually emerged as a product of her research into the Arcanasteel ring that was currently hidden within her horn. Twilight had been inspired to conduct more in-depth research into substances and materials that could be used as magical conduits. Shimmer silk was one of the more successful results. Rarity and Twilight had taken regular silk and treated it with a recipe of alchemical reagents. The final product had proven to be many things at once: durable, comfortable, light, and extremely versatile, in more ways than one. One of the things that the two of them had been able to work out about shimmer silk was that it could be magically programmed to assume different forms when magic was channeled through the fabric. The only downside that those forms had to be incorporated at the time of the garment's creation, and, as far as they could tell, no garment made from shimmer silk could maintain more than 3 different forms in total. Thank you so much for this, said Trixie as she twirled about in her dress. It's such a wonderful gift. She sighed. I just wish I would be able to use it. Once I finish my training, I won't be able to use the spells necessary to transform it. That's the nice thing about it, said Twilight. You don't have to. The different forms your hat and cape can take have already been laid into the fabric itself. All you need to do is channel your magic through it. It's just like flipping a switch. Oh, gasped Trixie, looking down at her dress again. That's wonderful. She quickly rushed up and hugged Twilight. This is the best heartwarming present any pony's ever given me. I'm happy for you, said Twilight with a giggle as she hugged Trixie back. After they separated, Trixie blushed and smiled sheepishly at Twilight. Can you turn it back now? Oh, exclaimed Twilight, of course. How are you liking your present? Asked Rarity as Flaxseed stared wordlessly at the item in his hooves. The item in question was a brand new abacus made from high-quality woods and polished to perfection. The sound of the beads clicking as they moved along the length of the rods was like music to Flaxseed's ears. When he'd been working on the Carousel Boutique's finances earlier that year, he'd had to simply use a great deal of scratch paper to work everything out. Having this abacus would simplify things, and the fact that it was such a high-quality one meant he would get many years of use out of it. It's wonderful, said Flaxseed, a warm feeling settling in his stomach. It was amazing how much a simple gift could mean, especially after all the things he had been through. It had been an excessively long time since any place had truly felt like home to him, but Ponyville was clearly one of those places. However, even as gratitude welled up within him, Flaxseed couldn't help but feel guilt to accompany it. This is such a wonderful gift, he said. I'm sorry I couldn't get anything for you. Don't worry about it, darling, said Rarity with ease. I understand that your finances are not very liquid right now. However, I do know of something akin to a gift, a favor that you could do for me. Name it, said Flaxseed quickly. Rarity grinned at him. I need you to go over the books again, she said. You see, while we were getting ready for the pageant at the palace, I was approached with a most interesting proposition. It seems that there is a young mare apprenticing in Canterlot who wants to finish said apprenticeship under me. I need you to go over our finances and see if there is any way we can squeeze in room for an extra pony here. Flaxseed tapped a hoof against his lips thoughtfully. Well, we had a little leeway, he admitted. I'll have to check on the details. If we take out a small loan, we could cover everything but debt can be a tricky thing to handle, said Rarity, nodding in agreement. It had taken a lot of work and care to pay off the original loans she had made to get her boutique built in the first place. I'm fairly certain that the bank can work out some reasonable terms, said Flaxseed quickly, but let me get back to you on that when I find out what we have to work with to begin with. Thank you very much for that, said Rarity. The sound of giggling drew her attention over to where Sweetie Belle and Luna were both enjoying a gift that Sweetie Belle had opened, a book of witty jokes from Pinkie Pie. It was a rather simple gift but an enjoyable one nonetheless. Among other things Sweetie had received included a book on magical instruction from Twilight and a brand new glitter-encrusted Crusader cape from Apple Bloom and Scootaloo. The latter gift served as a heartwarming reminder that though they'd found their cutie marks, Apple Bloom and Scootaloo wouldn't be abandoning the Crusaders, Sweetie Belle especially. All in all, though it had been a smaller, more intimate gathering than what Rarity had been expecting, this had turned out to be quite the excellent heartwarming. The previous night, after they had finished dinner, Sweetie had rushed out to pay a visit to Rumble, coming home late with a large goofy smile plastered across her face. It seemed being able to visit her cold friend on that most important of evenings had only served to make it extra special for her. Rarity was glad that she had invited Sweetie along when Luna had promised to bring them to Ponyville. Speaking of Rumble, his gift currently hung around Sweetie's neck. It was a light necklace of small, rosy pink pearls that shined beautifully in the light. Though she hadn't checked, Rarity was fairly certain that they were cultured pearls, rather than natural ones. There was no way Rumble would have been able to afford a necklace of natural pearls after all, certainly not with the money he'd earned from working in the tea shop for a few months. Still, given the Colt's means, it was an impressively lavish gift, one that Rarity found to be extremely romantic. I must make certain that we make arrangements to get him to Canterlot for the gala, she thought with a warm smile. It wouldn't do for Sweetie to be the only one out of her friends to be going without a date after all. Luna looked up from where she'd been lying next to Sweetie as the two of them read through the book. Seeing Flaxseed made Luna's smile falter a little, but she quickly rallied and stood up to join them. I wish to provide a heartwarming gift for you as well, Flaxseed. Shocked by Luna's words, Flaxseed's mouth had to work for a few minutes before he came up with an intelligible answer. That's not necessary, Your Highness. I mean, you don't need to get anything for me. Luna chuckled. Well, I have to admit that, after I learned about you, I did a little research into your situation. I found out what happened to you back when you were forced to leave home for the first time. Flaxseed gave Rarity a questioning look. Rarity merely shrugged. Don't look at me, dear. I shared that information with Twilight, of course, but I trust her discretion. Twilight Sparkle never mentioned it to me, said Luna. It was something I stumbled upon on my own. Anyway, after much research, I managed to uncover the location of your parents. Location, said Flaxseed, blinking. Are they still alive? They are, said Luna. They are currently living in a seaside town called Gallipoli. They have been doing quite well for themselves, if what I've heard is any indication, though they seem to be leery of trying to learn your fate. I don't blame them, said Flaxseed. It made sense. If they had tried too hard to look for him, then it would likely alert the cult Solar to their location, as well as his, if they were successful. The leadership of the cult most likely regarded his parents as traitors and criminals for aiding in his original escape. I am currently having a few members of the SES do a preliminary survey to make sure that they are not currently under the watch or control of the cult Solar, explained Luna. If they determine that it is safe, I will be more than happy to provide you with the information that you need to locate them so that you can visit them. She winked at Rarity. Don't worry. After what happened with Shadesteel, Tia and I have been making sure to vet our guards very thoroughly. I'm grateful for your help, Your Highness, said Flaxseed, bowing deeply. I only wish that I could repay your kindness. Luna smiled back at him. If you wish to do that, then do your utmost to live healthily and happily. That is the greatest blow that a pony like you can strike against the cult Solar, and that is the greatest solace that you can provide me. Flaxseed grinned. I'll do my best, he said, looking back at Rarity, then over at Sweetie Belle, both of whom favored him with happy smiles, but seeing the kind of ponies I've fallen in with, I don't think I'll have much choice in the matter, even if I didn't want to. With a coy giggle, Rarity leaned in and planted a light kiss on his cheek, the second one she'd given him lately. Flaxseed could only blush as he listened to Sweetie and Luna's giggles. After opening their presents, every pony was more or less free to do what they wished with the rest of their day. Twilight, Arkenstone and Spike departed to visit Twilight's parents, as well as Shining Armor and Cadence, who had spent the night and the following breakfast at their house. Every pony else spent the day enjoying their presents and each other's company. It wasn't until the day after that Rarity, Sweetie Belle, and Luna returned to the palace to join the group. The days following Heartswarming passed quite quietly. After the holiday had passed, the staff filtered back into the royal palace and business resumed like usual. However, for Celestia and Luna's guests, there was one last major event to look forward to before everyone returned to Ponyville. Are you sure that this is going to work out? Asked Twilight nervously as Rarity completed the final adjustments to her fitting. Absolutely, dear, said Rarity with absolute conviction. With this dress, you are going to be the toast of the evening and your special Sumpony won't be able to take his eyes off of you, so to speak. If you're sure, said Twilight, feeling surprisingly nervous. Ever since she'd made this request of Rarity, she'd been somewhat dubious of her own plan. She was sure that Rarity was more than up to the challenge, but the real question was whether or not Arkenstone would notice the difference. I'm absolutely certain, said Rarity. To be honest, I couldn't be happier that you've made this request of me. Your idea has opened up an entirely new dimension to my art and inspired me in ways that I had never thought possible. My muse hasn't stopped shouting into my ear for days on end. I'm really happy for that, said Twilight. Indeed, agreed Rarity. Between this and the shimmer silk that we've developed, I fully hope to obtain the royal warrant come springtime. That would be nice, said Twilight. Part of her felt a bit uneasy about the whole thing. The future of both Rarity and Applejack could hinge upon whether or not they were able to obtain the royal warrants for their respective businesses. While Twilight did not doubt that her two friends stood near the top of their respective fields, she couldn't help but worry. After all, Equestria was a big country. There were countless, highly skilled ponies who would be vying for the same honor and only a small hoeful could actually claim the prize. Twilight desperately hoped that her friends were among that number. Eep! Twilight's voice leapt out of her mouth in a shrill yelp as Rarity lightly pricked her with a pin between the shoulder blades. Come now, dear, said Rarity, giving Twilight an amused smile, this is no time for you to be pessimistic. We are here to indulge ourselves and, in your case, while away the evening hours with your special sumpony. This is not the time or place to be worrying about politics. Right, said Twilight in an irritable tone, but did you have to stick me? When you start one of those downward spirals of yours, drastic measures are sometimes required, declared Rarity loftily as she set her pins aside, but we're all finished now. I'll have to have you step off the podium. After all, I have to get through the other girls next. How does your dress feel? Twilight twirled about in her dress, analyzing the feeling of it against her coat and the skin underneath. It feels amazing, she admitted. The fabric was incredibly soft and light, gliding against her coat in the most wonderful fashion. Though it was wrapped securely around her body, Twilight had the strange sensation that the dress almost always seemed on the verge of floating away in the wind. She imagined that this is what wearing moonbeams might be like. Very good, dear, said Rarity with a triumphant grin. Would you like to stay for the rest of the girls? I'm sure that we could find some time for some highly interesting gossip. I'm sure we could, said Twilight, her mind drifting back to a previous session that they had enjoyed earlier in the week in the royal baths. I must say, said Rarity with a sly tone as she glanced sidelong at Fluttershy, who was lounging on one of the underwater benches next the alabaster mare, it would seem that this little vacation of ours was even better for some ponies than it was for others. Fluttershy's cheeks turned a shade of light pink as she gave Rarity a wary, yet friendly look. What do you mean? Rarity couldn't help but lift a hoof to her mouth as she giggled. Fluttershy dear, you're glowing. You look positively radiant and you haven't even had your beauty treatment yet. In perplexing display of combined shyness and happiness, Fluttershy's smile widened, even as the color in her cheeks deepened and she sank slightly in the water. Ah, well. Now tell me, said Rarity, leaning forward slightly, did something special happen between you and your stallion? I'd say so, said Rainbow Dash in a teasing tone from where she sat, on Fluttershy's other side. You should have seen the looks she was giving the guy after dinner on Heart's Warming Eve. If you ask me, I think she gave Caramel an extra special Heart's Warming present. Rarity couldn't contain her gasp of shock. Really, Fluttershy, is this true? Rarity, admonished Twilight sharply, that's a private matter for Fluttershy. If she doesn't want to talk about it, then we shouldn't pressure her. Turning her attention from the irate unicorn across the bath from her, Rarity once again looked at Fluttershy, not at all surprised to see that the canary-colored mare was slowly sinking into the bathwater until it had come up to her muzzle. She's right, of course. I'm terribly sorry, Fluttershy. It isn't my place to pry. Lifting herself just high enough above the waterline to free her mouth once again, Fluttershy gave Rarity a reassuring smile. Don't worry, Rarity. Actually, I wouldn't mind talking about it. So you did, prodded Rarity. Silent but still smiling, Fluttershy nodded. Oh, gasped Rarity, an exclamation that was joined by the rest of the mares in the bath. That's so wonderful, dear. Aw, gotta say, said Applejack, I'm awfully impressed by your gumption, Sugarcube. I'd never think in 100 years that y'd be the first one, as to take that step with some pony. Tell me about it, said Rainbow Dash, waving a hoof above the water. It used to be that Fluttershy couldn't even look at a stallion without turning into a shivering mess. I'm super duper excited, exclaimed Pinkie. In fact, I'm so excited that I could throw a party. She paused, seeming not to notice the utterly mortified looks of every pony else. But Mr. and Mrs. Cake always tell me that's not the sort of thing that I should be making a party for. I should certainly hope not, said Rarity in agreement with the absent Cakes. That is a private matter, not one to be broadcast across the width and breadth of Ponyville. She paused to cough delicately. So anyway, how was it, dear, if you don't mind me asking? I don't, said Fluttershy in her usual soft, whispery voice. It was. Well, it hurt at first. That is the norm for first times, said Rarity, nodding sagely. But after I got used to it, it was wonderful, said Fluttershy, her eyes drifting closed in blissful reminiscence. Caramel was so gentle and warm. She hummed softly. Fluttershy was so lost in her memories of the event that she completely failed to notice that every pony else was blushing fiercely, save for Melon Cream, the only mare in the bath right now who'd had experience in such matters. It sounds like you've found some pony very special, said Melon with a knowing look as she watched Fluttershy. You're very lucky to have found yourself such a wonderful special some pony. It sounds to me like the two of you might be looking at going farther than just sex, added Mayweather, who was blushing as much as the rest of the girls. Are you two planning to tie the knot? Well, that's certainly a possibility, admitted Fluttershy. If Caramel asked me, I wouldn't say no. Also, he's told me that he's going to be looking for buyers for his house. Hold on, exclaimed Rainbow, nearly shooting out of the water in surprise. You mean he's gonna be moving in with you? Well, that's pretty much the obvious course of action, said Twilight. I mean, there's no way Fluttershy's going to give up all her animal friends and she can't bring them to Caramel's house, which is inside the town. So he'd pretty much have to move in with her. Rainbow sagged slightly. Yeah, well, that's true. She blushed as she heard Fluttershy's faint tittering. It sure looks like things are going mighty swell, fair y'all, said Applejack. We're pleased as punch, fair y'all. Thank you, said Fluttershy. Oh dear, I'm almost as excited as Pinkie Pie, said Rarity, rubbing her hooves together. I can't wait to get started on your wedding dress. And I get to plan the reception, added Pinkie gleefully. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, every pony, said Twilight, raising a hoof as she saw Fluttershy sinking back beneath the water. Let's let Fluttershy take care of things at her own pace and just be ready for when she needs our help, okay? Yes, of course, said Rarity. Okie dokie Loki, said Pinkie, seemingly oblivious to Fluttershy's near-complete submersion. Sure, why not, said Twilight as her mind came back to the present. It could be fun. Spike yawned and stretched his arms upwards, arching his spine until the bones popped loudly. Geez, is Rumble's train ever going to get here? It will get here when it gets here, said Dawn, eyeing the schedule. It should only be a few more minutes. I am sure that there will be plenty of time to visit Donut Joe's. In truth, Dawn wasn't quite enthused with the idea, given his lack of fondness for sweets. However, Spike had insisted that it was a tradition to visit the donut shop with the guys, though exactly who constituted the guys was a detail that Spike had been rather reluctant to define more thoroughly. Yeah, but we'll have to rush a little bit, groused Spike. We'll need to get back to the palace and change into our suits, and then Rarity'll probably want to make some final adjustments or something. Dawn couldn't help but smile slightly at Spike's irritation. If I recall what the others have told me, there was a time when you would have been overjoyed at the idea of spending that much time close with Rarity. Spike turned to glare at the ebony colt. You know, sometimes I yearn for the days before you learned how to snark. Dawn merely shrugged. When in Rome. I never thought that I'd honestly regret being a bad influence on some pony, said Spike as he slapped a hand to his face with a sigh. Even as they bantered, Dawn kept a wary eye out. The platform wasn't exactly crowded, but it wasn't remotely close to deserted either. Now that the holiday had passed, many ponies were either leaving Canterlot after coming to visit relatives or coming from doing the same abroad. Other trains were arriving at different platforms right now. Ponies were coming and going in droves. Amongst them were no small shortage of the Canterlot upper crust. Even as he and Spike waited, they were subjected to a large number of stares. Dawn supposed there was no helping it really. His eyes were an oddity that had the potential to attract a great deal of attention. Adding to that, thanks to the article that had been written about him, he was now known far and wide across Equestria. There was no shortage of ponies who recognized him. Spike, of course being a dragon, was just as much of an oddity in his own way. Dawn was both grateful and mildly surprised that no pony had made any attempt to harass or even approach them. Of course, amongst all the looks and stares, Dawn could make out the occasional expression of condescension or even outright revulsion. Whether it was him or Spike that was drawing those reactions, possibly both, Dawn couldn't say. Fortunately, the screech of brakes drew Dawn's attention back to the platform itself, where the train that had come through Ponyville was just now pulling in, just on time. Dawn and Spike waited anxiously, watching the ponies stream off the train. Then, a young gray colt took to the air, lugging a small suitcase with him as his grayish-purple eyes swept over the platform until they alighted on Dawn and Spike. Hey guys, shouted Rumble as he swooped down to join them. About time you got here, grumbled Spike. It's not as though he could have made the train go faster, Dawn pointed out. Yeah, added Rumble indignantly, what did you expect me to do, get out and push? Sorry, said Spike, I'm just really antsy. I've never actually had a date for the Winter Gala before. It's making me kinda nervous. The two Pegasus colts shared a confused look. It can't be all that different from going to the Harvest Festival, said Rumble. Trust me, it's loads different, said Spike. Taking Rumble's suitcase from him, Spike hefted it over his shoulder. Come on, we've got some donuts to eat before it's time. Oh, groaned Dawn as he stared ahead glumly, I can't believe you talked me into that. Oh come on, griped Spike, you didn't even have half a donut. Dawn didn't answer, still too preoccupied with getting his rebellious stomach back under control. It was a work in progress. Donut Joe's namesake confections were as sweet and decadent as any creation of Pinkie Pie's. Dawn had been reluctant to try his luck with one of them at first. However, continued prodding from Spike had prompted him to give in. I suppose Miss Cheerilee could use this for a lecture on why peer pressure is a bad thing, mused Dawn sourly. At least Donut Joe had been understanding enough not to lose his temper when Dawn set aside the uneaten half of his donut and turned a disturbing shade of green. That had been an hour ago and Dawn's queasiness still hadn't completely subsided. You remind me a bit of what it's like for me whenever I go out with the other stallions for drinks, said Arkenstone as he trotted out to join them. But you don't drink, Caramel pointed out wryly. I can't, replied Arkenstone, my liver is deficient of the enzyme that metabolizes alcohol. When I drink, rather than get drunk, I simply get sick. I have no tolerance to speak of. The males, both colts and stallions, were presently waiting outside the dressing room, or rather, Rarity's guest suite in the royal palace, which she had at last partially converted into an extension of her boutique. The girls were within, getting their final fittings for their dresses, while the stallions, colts, and one dragon, waited with varying degrees of patience outside. Geez, I'm starting to get a weird sense of déjà vu, muttered Spike. The others nodded. After all, this was starting to become a familiar situation for all of them. A few minutes later, the doors swung open. Dawn couldn't keep a warm smile from his face as Scootaloo came striding out, looking a bit shy, even blushing slightly as she approached him. She was wearing the same dress that she'd worn to the Harvest Festival, but had augmented it with the pendant that he'd given her for heart's warming. Apple Bloom and Sweetie Belle followed her, both of them likewise clad in their own dresses from the festival. Like Scootaloo, Sweetie's ensemble was augmented by the pearl necklace Rumble had given her. Well, Bloom, I can understand, said Spike, but I'm surprised that Rarity didn't at least make Sweetie a new dress. Sweetie Belle shrugged. Well, Rarity got really busy making dresses for the others. I didn't want to bother her. Spike nodded sagely. He knew from experience that Rarity would work herself to the bone for the sake of her friends and family if asked. No pony was keen to put that kind of pressure on her when she already had her hooves full running her own business. It's bad enough that she wouldn't stop fussing with our manes, grumbled Scootaloo, using a hoof to idly play with some strands of her mane. Dawn hooked his fetlock around her own and pulled her hoof back down, prompting Scootaloo to give him a questioning look. You don't want her to drag you back in, do you? Inquired Dawn in a playful tone, prompting a giggle from Scootaloo. Good heavens, Scootaloo, do not ruin your mane already, protested Rarity from within, making Scootaloo wince. She's scary sometimes, muttered the orange filly. The doors now swung open wide to reveal Rarity poised in a dress of stunning royal purple and dark blue highlights. The dress glittered as countless small gemstone fragments caught the light. As Rarity moved to stride out from the doors, her audience's ears could pick up the faint tinkling sound almost reminiscent of dozens of tiny bells playing. She passed between Caramel and Red River. Caramel's nose twitched as he picked up a faint smell in the air. Smells like roses, he said after a moment. Indeed, said Rarity, spinning about and waving an imperious hoof at the doorway, may I present to you, the future of equestrian fashion. Applejack was first out of the gate clad in a deep forest green dress with undulating borders of tan along the hem, which complemented her Stetson. Her hooves were clad in boots that clicked in a pleasant staccato against the marble floor as she trotted towards Red River with a slight but sultry smile on her face. What do y'all think, Sugarcube? She asked teasingly as she turned to brush the skirt of her dress across Red's flank. Red blinked as the fabric slid across his coat. At first, he thought it felt slightly coarse, but that was countered by an almost feathery softness. As the dress passed under his nose, Red's nostrils were tantalized by the faint scent of apples, what else with lingering notes of cinnamon, nutmeg, and the faint odor of citrus. It's wonderful, he said as Applejack sidled up next to him, but the scent is making me a little hungry. There'll be food at the gala, hun, said Applejack with a chuckle, y'all can wait. Pinkie Pie was next, bouncing out of the room with a heavily ruffled gown that seemed to float about her with each bounce. The gown was a mix of pink and yellow stripes that flowed away from Pinkie's back towards the skirt behind her. Like Rarity, her motions were accented by the sound of bells, or rather, a bell striking a faint but clear note every time she came down after going up. Mayweather accompanied Pinkie out of the dressing room, clad in a rather simple dress with the same green, blue, and magenta color scheme as her mane and tail. She couldn't help but smile as she leaned up against Pinkie, forcing the energetic party pony to settle onto the floor and relax a little. Leaning against Pinkie's dress was like sinking into a fluffy pillow as Mayweather breathed in the aromas of flour and yeast, accompanied by the faintest hint of chili peppers which seemed to have been woven into the fabric as thoroughly as the threads that made it up. Easy there, try to save something for the actual party, said Mayweather playfully. Aw, okay. Pinkie sagged a little at the idea of restraining herself but acquiesced nonetheless. Mayweather couldn't help but giggle in response. My turn, exclaimed Rainbow Dash, coming out after Pinkie and Mayweather had cleared the doorway. As she came out, she spun in place slightly to give her audience a sideways view of her, allowing the light blue feathery wisps that made up her skirt to flare out like an extra set of wings, sending the refreshing scent of rainfall washing over the group. What do y'all think, Squirt? Asked Rainbow, grinning at Scootaloo. It looks awesome, said Scootaloo, grinning back up at her idol. It certainly fits her well, added Melon Cream as she followed in Rainbow's wake, a warm smile on her face. Like Mayweather, Melon hadn't gotten the chance to get one of Rarity's new brand of creations made for her. However, she made a fine picture in her own right, wearing a silky, deep crimson dress that flashed in the light as she walked. You're coming too, Mom? Asked Scootaloo, a bit surprised to see her mother, of all ponies, there. The princesses were kind enough to invite me as well, said Melon with a warm smile. Leaning down, she whispered into Scootaloo's ear, don't worry, I'll keep my distance so that you don't get smothered. Thanks, Mom, said Scootaloo, taking the opportunity to nuzzle her mother's cheek. All right then, said Rarity, turning her attention back to the doorway. Fluttershy. It's your turn. Oh, okay. Fluttershy tentatively stepped into view, blushing slightly as she saw Caramel watching her. Caramel's heart thudded alarmingly in his chest as he got to see Fluttershy's new dress. The whole affair was the same shade of teal as her eyes. It clung closely to her frame, showing off her slender figure and whispered quietly with every step she took. Her flowing pink mane had been drawn back and tied into a tail, not unlike the style Applejack usually wore. As she closed in with Caramel, he caught a whiff of fresh pine wafting through the air. Hooking his neck around Fluttershy's, his chin brushed up against the fabric of the dress where it came over her shoulders. It felt silky smooth against him. Do you like it? Asked Fluttershy softly. I love it, said Caramel, pulling back away from her, planting a light kiss on the side of her neck as he did so, which prompted a giggle from Fluttershy as her blush deepened. You look wonderful, Mom, commented Dawn from where he stood next to Scootaloo and Melon, which only made Fluttershy smile more widely. Well then, said Rarity, pulling her gaze away from the lovebirds, last but certainly not least. Twilight dear, it's time for your debut. Okay. Surprisingly, Twilight Sparkle seemed even more uncertain that Fluttershy had. She carefully sidled into view. Her mane had been tied up tightly into a bun behind the back of her head. She was clad in a dress of an even darker, deeper shade of purple than Rarity's. The hem was accented by a single, thin streak of hot pink that ran along its length. The folds of the skirt seemed to alternate in patterns of texture, smooth and shimmery along one pleat, lacy and ruffled along the next, which were only visible to the naked eye as a slight difference in the shading. How does she look? Arkenstone whispered to Red River. She looks very beautiful, said Red, a sly smile spreading over his face, but I think that Miss Rarity reserved the true beauty of her dress for you to witness for yourself. On Red's other side, Applejack blinked in confusion and stared at her cold friend. Stepping forward, Arkenstone could hear the whispering of Twilight's dress, soft and subtle, like a gentle caress against his ears. A second later, as she met him in turn, the light scents of lavender and hydrangea danced into his nostrils. Rarity had gone especially light with working scented oils into the cloth of Twilight's dress, in order not to overwhelm Arkenstone's acute sense of smell. As a result, the scents from the flowers mingled with Twilight's own, stirring up a sense of warmth and affection from within Arkenstone as he recalled the earliest days of their friendship back when they were foals. Then he felt Twilight's gown brush against him. Arkenstone's deft sense of touch immediately perceived the alternating textures of her skirt's pleats, one smooth and light, the other soft and full. The feeling of the fabric alternately ruffling his coat then smoothing it out made Arkenstone's muscles quiver, and before he'd even realized it, he'd raised a hoof in order to run his sensitive frog along the length of the skirt, gently brushing it along Twilight's back as he did so. His eyes had opened, the appearance of the milky white orbs betraying the beige stallion's surprise and enchantment. Twilight's cheeks were heating up like they were on fire. Never had she felt Arkenstone's hooves wander across her body so freely. Naturally, as they were in an early, rather reserved stage of their relationship, he'd always been at least somewhat conservative with physical contact. Now, however, the feeling of his hoof running along her back pressing the fabric of her dress up against her own body made Twilight's heart beat faster, and then pick up pace as Arkenstone slowly moved to bring his nose closer to her shoulder and inhale deeply, seeming to drink in her scent and the aromas woven into the dress that faintly complemented her own. Is this what it's like? Wondered Twilight as she leaned in to gently nuzzle up against Arkenstone's neck. Is this what it's like to have some pony look at you like you're beautiful? Arkenstone, like the rest of her friends and family, would probably have argued that Twilight already looked beautiful. But now, after seeing it with Fluttershy and Caramel, Red and Applejack, Rainbow and Soren, Pinkie and Mayweather, Twilight could understand what it meant to essentially cultivate that beauty and use it to captivate her special sumpony. From off to the side, Rarity couldn't help but watch in triumph as Arkenstone was enthralled by Twilight's beauty, a beauty that he was exploring with all of his available senses. Of course, Twilight's visual impact wasn't to be underestimated either. With her talents, she had brought out Twilight's beauty for all to see and experience through all the senses to make her shine in a way that a blind stallion, like Arkenstone, could perceive for himself. This may be my greatest success yet, she thought proudly. My friends truly are the source of my greatest inspiration. The receding sound of hoofsteps caught Rarity's attention and she noticed that Melon was carefully ushering the foals off down the hallway. Looking over her shoulder, Melon flashed Rarity a sheepish grin. Blinking, Rarity realized what she was doing. Oh yes, I suppose that what Arkenstone and Twilight are doing does have rather intimate overtones, she admitted as her cheeks flushed. Perhaps we should give them a moment. Reaching over, she quietly tapped Mayweather's shoulder, getting her attention. As Mayweather looked over, Rarity gently signaled that they should probably head out. Mayweather, catching the hint, nodded and turned to tap Pinky's shoulder in turn. Though Pinky, being Pinky, was admittedly more reluctant to abandon watching her friends being so happy with each other, they managed to convince her to tap Rainbow, who in turn tapped Applejack, who signaled Red, who signaled Caramel, who gently nudged Fluttershy away from Twilight and Arkenstone. The group followed Melon and the foals down the hallway, giving Twilight and Arkenstone some much-needed privacy. Twilight and Arkenstone didn't fail to notice their friends heading off. Twilight couldn't suppress a light giggle. Should we follow them? Asked Arkenstone. No, it's fine, said Twilight, pressing harder up against him and resting her head across his shoulders. I want to stay like this for just a little bit longer. I think I can do that, said Arkenstone. He was feeling a bit reluctant to pull away himself. You went through this for me. Of course I did, said Twilight. I wanted to dress up and look my best, in a way that you could experience for yourself. She stepped away from Arkenstone to quickly lift a hoof to his lips as he opened his mouth. I know what you'll say, she said. You'll say that I'm always beautiful to you. Arkenstone nodded. But I wanted more than that, said Twilight, leaning in again, this time pressing her cheek up against Arkenstone's. I don't think I can really put it into words. Rarity's dressed me up dozens of times. But I wanted to experience that feeling that all my friends have experienced. I wanted you to really see me as a mare, not just as the little filly you've grown really close to. Arkenstone let out a quiet sigh. Well, I can't exactly argue with that. You feel wonderful, Twilight. It makes me so happy that I get to be here with you. Turning his head, Arkenstone captured Twilight's lips with a surprising degree of passion, making TW Light hum lightly as she returned the pressure of the kiss, leaning into it even as Arkenstone raised a hoof around her neck to pull her closer. The two of them enjoyed the experience a few minutes longer before they finally pulled away. For a moment they rested their foreheads together, Twilight being careful about the angle to keep from poking Arkenstone with her horn. I guess we should go, she said finally. I suppose so, said Arkenstone, feeling surprisingly reluctant. Twilight giggled and danced away from her stallion, spinning about so that the hem of her gown kicked up off the ground and brushed ever so lightly across Arkenstone's nose. Come on then, she said playfully, we've got a gala to attend. Author's notes. I rather like the ideas I had for the dresses worn by the main six, especially as they turned out inside my head. Unfortunately, I can't draw worth a damn, so no pictures. I hope I did a halfway decent job of describing them at least. Next chapter, a party within a party, partyception. August assemblage. Chapter 23, August assemblage. Every pony's eyes widened as they took in the grand vista of the royal palace's main ballroom, decorated with the trappings of the winter gala. Pale blue ribbons and shimmering crystals ran between columns and twined about them, the crystals catching the light radiating off the chandeliers and throwing it about the cavernous room with almost wild abandon. Throughout the room, ponies dressed in a variety of outfits mingled and chatted, while others pranced about the dance floor. Soft music from a familiar quartet drifted about the room, setting a peaceful, reserved atmosphere. Sweetie's eyes widened even further and she couldn't keep a gasp from escaping her as she recognized Octavia, standing proudly upright on stage, moving her cello's bow with long, precise motions, adding the instrument's warm, enchanting voice to the melody carried by her companions. Octavia was clad in a shimmering black dress that clung tightly to her body, showing her every movement as she swayed in time with her own music. Seemingly feeling eyes upon her, Octavia turned her attention to Sweetie and threw the filly a playful wink before returning her full attention to her playing. The rest of the group was busy taking the sights. Rarity had to suppress the urge to yelp when she heard a familiar voice by her ear. You and your friends resplendent tonight, Miss Rarity. Twirling about, Rarity pressed a forehoof to her chest as she took deep, steadying breaths. Oh, you startled me there, fancy pants. She managed to regain enough of her composure to give him a playful smile. Isn't it rather poor manners to sneak up on a defenseless lady like that? I'd say that too, said a familiar-looking white mare, decked out in a similarly white dress. Her flowing pink mane was unmistakable. Ah, Fleur, how are you faring? Asked Rarity, excitedly rushing up to embrace Fancy's wife. Fleur de Lis laughed lightly as she returned the embrace, the two of them rising up on their hind legs to do so properly. As they hugged, Rarity could feel the bulge of Fleur's abdomen pressing against her. Well enough, dear, said Fleur lightly as they settled back down. Her tail whipped out from beneath the wide skirts of her dress to snap playfully against Fancy's flank, drawing a yelp from Fancy as his mustache bristled, the monocle nearly popping out of his eye in surprise. As I was saying, Fancy seems to enjoy making mares squeak. I think he likes the sounds they make when they're surprised. Well, you have to admit that you make the most adorable sounds when you're startled, my dearest, teased Fancy as he leaned in to nuzzle up against her cheek. Agreed Fleur in a playful tone as she leaned back out of his reach, and the other mares. Well, they do have a delightful assortment of sounds, admitted Fancy. You tease, chided Fleur with a laugh. But none nearly so wonderful as yours, quickly added Fancy as his horn lit and a faint spark of magic tweaked Fleur's ear, eliciting a delightful squeak from her. Her elbow came up and jabbed him sharply in the ribs. Behave, she admonished through an amused smirk. Rarity couldn't help but giggle. Part of her adored watching the married couple bicker and play fight. It showed the sheer depth of their love for one another that they could tease and taunt each other so easily with no ill feelings whatsoever. Rarity desperately hoped that she herself might find such a strong connection with some pony in the future. I take it the little one is coming along well, said Rarity. Fleur's dress had clearly been designed to hide the lines of her figure, which made a certain sort of sense. In the circles that Fleur and her husband regularly moved, even the slightest perception of weight gain, regardless of the cause, would be enough to draw ridicule. It was a terrible, disgusting truth, but a truth nonetheless. There aren't any complications so far, said Fleur, gently rubbing her bulge through the fabric of the dress, though pregnancy is no treat, let me tell you. I imagine the cravings you must get are interesting, ventured Rarity, though she had no desire to find out exactly how interesting said cravings got. The mood swings are probably difficult to cope with as well. Oh hardly, scoffed Fancy Pants with a chuckle, as mercurial as she can be by default, I've hardly even noticed a difference. That got him a cuff across the back of the head that knocked his monocle off. It took the disgruntled stallion a moment to work it back in place before he gave Rarity a playful smile. See, business as usual. Oh you, huffed Fleur, though she was clearly trying to hide a smile. And how are your friends faring? Asked Fancy, are Twilight Sparkle and Sir Arkenstone getting along well? Well enough, said Rarity, they were being irritatingly slow. However, I suspect tonight has brought their relationship a great step forward. Is that so? Asked Fleur, and here I thought that Arkenstone was far too stiff to ever consider a romantic relationship. I think he may have reconsidered, said Rarity with no small amount of pride. After all, the dress I made for Twilight has knocked his socks off, or so to speak. Fancy blinked. Dress. But isn't Arkenstone blind? Indeed, said Rarity before turning to Fleur, I'm sure that a seasoned model like yourself noticed some things about my dress when we greeted each other. I did, admitted Fleur, coming in closer to run a hoof along the fabric going over Rarity's shoulder. The fabric feels wonderful, so soft and silky, and it has a lovely scent as well. It was Twilight's idea, explained Rarity. She wished to pretty herself up in a way that a blind pony like Arkenstone could appreciate. Since he can't see, I turned to looking at other options. Arkenstone sees with his nose, his ears, and his hooves. Twilight's request actually opened up an entirely new dimension of fashion to me. I decided to experiment in how to bring out a pony's inner beauty, not just through visual appearance but through texture, scent, and sound. If Arkenstone's reaction was anything to go by, I believe my efforts have paid tremendous dividends. Oh, that's simply wonderful, exclaimed Fleur, clapping her hooves together. Once my foal is born, I'll have to ask you to make one of those dresses for me. It sounds fascinating. I'll be happy to do that for you, said Rarity. Once word of this gets out, I'm sure that you'll be swarmed with orders, noted Fancy, studying Rarity's dress with academic interest. It's lucky then that I'll have some extra help, said Rarity. Turning her head, she let her eyes wander across the gathering until her gaze found a particular pair of mares that Rarity had known would be present. After all, the Winter Gala also served as a late after-party of sorts for the cast and crew of the pageant. Rarity used her magic to gently prod the older mare on the shoulder, drawing her attention. Once she was spotted, Rarity quickly waved her over. I'm sure you know Miss Lockstitch, said Rarity as the dark red mare and her younger companion approached. She and her apprentice are the ones behind the pageant's ensembles. Indeed he does know us, said Lockstitch with an easy smile. After all, you were the one to recommend us for the job, weren't you, my lord? Please, there is no need to be so formal here, said Fancy with a casual wave, but yes, I did put the suggestion to the princesses that you were suited for the job. However, I had no idea that your apprentice would do such a fine job. Coco Pommel blushed fiercely under Fancy's praise. It was already a lot for her to handle, being surrounded by such important ponies. But to have one of the Marquess's stature praising her work was almost too much to bear. When I return to Ponyville, Coco Pommel here will be coming with me, said Rarity proudly. She has stated, with Miss Lockstitch's support I might add, that she wishes to finish out her apprenticeship under me. Coco nodded eagerly, breaking into an excited smile at the prospect. Fleur smiled and giggled at Coco's eagerness. Then I shall wish you the best, Miss Pommel. I know that Rarity here will take good care of you. I certainly look forward to seeing your work in the future. Coco froze, her smile breaking as she gasped in astonishment. Oh, I mean, I'd be honored, my lady. I don't think anything I could make could compare to Miss Rarity's work, but... Come now, said Fleur, stepping in close, causing Coco to close her mouth so quickly that her teeth clacked audibly. Fleur raised a hoof and gently brushed back the strands of Coco's mane. There's no need indulge in such self-deprecation. Lockstitch and Rarity wouldn't speak so highly of your potential if they didn't mean it. Humility is good, so is recognizing your limits. But you also need to believe in yourself. She gave Coco a friendly, almost motherly hug, which was only enforced by the presence of the developing foal being pressed lightly between them. I know you'll go on to do grand things. Thank you so much, whispered Coco, scrunching her eyes closed as she tried to stem the tide of tears welling up inside. She stepped away from Fleur, sniffling and wiping at her eyes, trying her hardest to get her feelings under control. There now, said Rarity with a soft smile as she levitated a hoof kerchief and gently dabbed at Coco's eyes. There's no need to bottle up your feelings. You are amongst friends. Rarity decided to give Coco a hug of her own as Coco continued to sob with now unrestrained happiness. Somewhere, in the way back of her head, but still definitely somewhere back there, Rainbow Dash knew that yawning at an event like this was a serious faux pas. But she couldn't help herself. As far as she was concerned, it was boring as hay. Sure, the music sounded nice, but it wasn't the kind of music Rainbow liked. Nor did she care about silly things like ballroom dancing or dainty treats preferred by the high-class types that frequented events like this or the insipid conversations of aristocratic stallions and mares. Why did I agree to come to this again? She wondered to herself. She figured that a smaller, less publicized event would have the leeway to be livelier, but it looked like that wasn't going to be the case. The princesses should have invited DJ Pawn 3. She'd shake things up. A sigh escaped her mouth as she continued to observe the small groups of well-dressed ponies socializing and dancing throughout the ballroom. She recognized several of them as the crew and the supplemental cast of the hearth-warming pageant. There were a few others as well, possibly wealthy benefactors. Fortunately, the stiffest of the stiff upper-crust ponies that had made the Grand Galloping Gala such a drag appeared to have been exempted from this particular event, which was just fine, as far as Rainbow is concerned. As it seemed that there was no one interesting to talk to. As the quartet playing up on the stage started up another song, a hoof tapped lightly on Rainbow's shoulder. Excuse me, miss, might I have this dance? Rainbow's whole body went rigid at the sound and teasing tone of the voice. She briefly became a cerulean blur as she spun about to face the other pony, her jaw dropping as she took in the familiar and welcome sight of the pale blue stallion standing just slightly behind her. Soren. Soren, looking quite smart in his dress uniform, as always flashed an earnest smile at Rainbow. Hey there, I thought you were looking kinda bored. We could. The rest of his sentence was lost as Rainbow slammed into him, knocking Soren off his hooves and sending them crashing into the wall behind him. The stallion opened his mouth to grunt in pain as his back collided harshly with the unyielding marble, but even that was silenced as Rainbow's own mouth crashed against his in an intense kiss that made all thoughts of pain fade from Soren's head as he returned the kiss with equal enthusiasm and wrapped his hooves around Rainbow, holding her tightly to him. When their mouths finally parted, Soren was gasping for breath, in part because of the kiss's intensity, but also because slamming into the wall had knocked the wind out of him and Rainbow had denied him the chance to get it back. However, he didn't hold it against her and instead pulled her up against himself, resting his chin against her shoulder so that their necks were pressed together. He savored the warmth of her presence even as his hooves explored the fabric of her dress, which brushed against him like faint wisps of woven cirrus cloud. Inhaling deeply, he reveled in Rainbow's scent, which mingled with the faint smell of freshly fallen rain. "I missed you," he said softly. "I missed you too," said Rainbow, finally pulling back far enough for them to look each other in the eyes. "What are you doing here?" "The princesses invited the Wonderbolts to the winter gala," explained Soren with a grin. "Really? So Spitfire and the others are here?" asked Rainbow, grinning like a filly. Chuckling, Soren nodded. "And a few other ponies besides. Some of them are quite eager to meet you." They finally let go of each other so they could settle back in their hooves. "Really?" asked Rainbow, canting her head. "Who else besides the Wonderbolts would want to meet me?" She found it hard to imagine any of the stuffed shirts who usually frequented events like this wanting to have anything to do with her. "Come on," said Soren, draping a wing over her back. "I'll show you. I think you're gonna like them." He led Rainbow away from the ballroom and towards one of the adjoining chambers. "What about that dance?" asked Rainbow. Soren favored her with a playful grin. "We'll have it later. The night is young after all." Twilight couldn't quite keep the blush from her face as she and Arkenstone entered the ballroom. Looking about, Twilight tried to pin down some familiar faces, even as she eyed the dance floor with interest. Dancing with Steel Flint at his little social event had been a hideously uncomfortable experience. But perhaps dancing with Arkenstone would be much more appealing. As it was, the beige stallion seemed glued to her side, continuing to explore and indulge in the textures of her dress with his barrel and haunches. Though she was a bit uncomfortable with the two of them showing their affection so publicly, Twilight couldn't help but feeling triumphant in that her plan had worked out so well. The dress Rarity had made for her was apparently holding the normally unshakable knight spellbound. "There you two are. I was worried when your friends showed up without you." Cadance grinned cheerfully as she and Shining Armor trotted up to join them. "Well, we just got a bit caught up," said Twilight, her blush deepening. "Oh," Shining's own grin became mischievous as he looked at the two of them. "What did the two of you get caught up doing, "Stop that, you," chided Cadance, bumping her husband gently with her shoulder, noting that Twilight's face was completely red. Arkenstone, of course, seemed not to notice Shining's jibes. Seeing the two of them leaning together made Cadance want to leap with joy. Her own magic could also detect the deepening affection between the two of them, making it clear to her senses that the pair had grown closer since she had last seen them, which hadn't been all that long ago, come to think of it. Twilight and her beloved sister-in-law fell into a lively chat together. Arkenstone finally pulled himself away from Twilight's side to talk with Shining. Said Shining, "I see the two of you have been making progress." "Slowly," said Arkenstone with a shrug. "I have to admit that this is unfamiliar territory for me. Even with what happened between us the last time we were in Canterlot, I still have a hard time as seeing Twilight as something other than my best friend's adorable little sister." "But that changed tonight?" asked Shining as he raised an inquisitive eyebrow. "Somewhat," said Arkenstone with a fond smile, one ear swiveling in Twilight's direction as she laughed at some joke Cadance was telling her. She and her friend went through a great deal of effort when it came to her dress. "I've always been telling myself that Twilight has grown into a wonderful mare. But tonight the way she dressed has brought that to the forefront." To Shining's shock and amazement, a faint blush actually blossomed on Arkenstone's cheeks. He'd once thought he'd never live to see his old friend act like that. "Looks like you've got it bad," he teased. "I suppose so," admitted Arkenstone readily enough. "After tonight, I don't think I could bring myself to stay away from her. She's some pony precious that I want to hold for the rest of my life." "Good," said Shining. "I wouldn't accept anything less from you." Meanwhile, Twilight and Cadance were on a slightly different tangent. "I always love this time of year," sighed Cadance as she looked around. "It's wonderful to see so much earnest love amongst my little ponies." "Though I bet Hearts and Hooves Day is better," mused Twilight. Twilight was actually surprised to see Cadance sigh with a mild degree of despondence. "You don't like Hearts and Hooves Day?" asked Twilight in confusion. She'd never really spoken on the subject with Cadance before. "Well, yes and no," said Cadance with a sigh. "It's technically my official holiday, just like the Summer Sun celebration is Auntie Celestia's and Nightmare Night is Auntie Luna's." Twilight nodded slowly in agreement. "But," again, Cadance sighed, "it just seems so pretentious at times. The only thing I truly love about Hearts and Hooves Day is when it serves as the impetus for ponies to confess their feelings to one another. But I always feel it puts too much pressure on ponies that already are together, in whatever stage of their relationship they might be. There's always so much pressure to come up with some kind of romantic gesture, and it always has to be better than last year's. Ponies try to take their relationship to the next level even when it's obvious they're not ready. I swear, a few dozen of the marriages that are proposed or conducted on that day end up broken because the ponies taking that step aren't ready for that level of commitment and end up doing serious harm to their relationship in the long run." "When you put it that way, that actually sounds kind of awful," Twilight admitted. Cadance nodded. "Twilight," she said, turning to regard the lavender mare with careful eyes, "that's why I want to request this of you. When the next Hearts and Hooves Day comes around, please don't feel that you have to do something incredibly special or profound for Arkenstone. A romantic dinner or a quiet date is fine, but please don't get caught up in trying to create some kind of grand gesture of love, and please don't try to do something you're not ready for." Twilight nodded, having a fair idea of what that something Cadance was talking about probably was. She and Arkenstone had gotten closer, but were definitely not at the stage where either of them would seriously consider becoming lovers in the more active sense. "Good," said Cadance. "I hope Arkenstone doesn't feel that he has to do that either. I know that he's probably mature enough for that, but this is his first real experience with romantic love after all." She winked at Twilight. "Just as it is for you. I honestly hope that the two of you will truly work out." "So do I," said Twilight. Their conversation was stalled as Arkenstone stepped between them. "I beg your pardon, Cadance, but Twilight and I have somewhere to be. For a moment, Cadence blinked in confusion. What do you mean, oh? Her eyes widened and an almost devilish smile blossomed across her face. That, she chuckled. Yes, we certainly wouldn't want Twilight to miss a chance like this. Like what? Asked Twilight, looking between Cadence and Arkenstone. Oh, you'll see, said Cadence in a teasing sing-song tone. Come with me, said Arkenstone, bumping gently against Twilight and using the contact to steer her towards one of the doors out of the ballroom. This is a truly rare event, one that I think you'll find fascinating, if only for its sheer novelty. Okay, said Twilight with no small degree of uncertainty as she allowed Arkenstone to guide her out, casting one look over her shoulder at Shining and Cadence as the latter waved goodbye to them. Cadence chuckled as she watched them go. Our little Twilly's going to be in for a shock. That's true, agreed Shining as he turned towards another door. Where are you going? Asked Cadence. I'm going to see if I can coax our very own Ebenezer Scrooge out to join the festivities, replied Shining. Good luck, said Cadence as she saw her husband off. Well, this is kind of boring, muttered Scootaloo, glancing around the ballroom. The foals had split up after Melon had guided them to the ballroom. Scootaloo found herself wondering if she and the other Crusaders plus Spike were the only younglings at the event. However, she'd occasionally seen other colts and fillies roaming about with their parents, though not many. Maybe there's a room set aside for ponies closer to our age, suggested Dawn, eyeing the exits. That would make sense, agreed Scootaloo, wishing that they'd checked with Pinkie Pie as to whether or not that was the case. There wasn't much for them to do in this room, save maybe sample the food at the buffet. Neither of them was interested in trying their hoof at dancing, and even if they were more likely to be a trip hazard for the adults than actual participants. Don cast his eyes about, looking for one of the waiters or any other servants who wandered about the room with various drinks and dainties on offer for the guests. Any one of them would probably know where the foals were supposed to go and would probably be the ponies most likely to actually answer their question. Scootaloo and Don felt another pony approach them at the same time, their wings twitching almost in unison as they picked up the faint surge in the air that built up ahead of the mare coming towards them like the bow wave of a boat. Their mutual training kicking in, the two of them turned about in unison to face the unknown pony with a synchronicity that was almost eerie. It was with a slight amount of surprise that the two of them found themselves facing a familiar-looking pink alicorn, who was watching them with nearly as much confusion and surprise as they were feeling. Okay, said Cadence, blinking slowly, I'll admit that was kinda creepy to watch. Don and Scootaloo looked at one another in confusion before turning back to Cadence. You mean the way we moved together? Asked Scootaloo. Cadence let out a laugh. Yes, that. I guess it makes sense. The two of you have the same training, the same sense, and you have a lot of experience reading one another as well, which is what probably allowed the two of you to move in unison like that. Scootaloo scratched her head. Sure. Is there something you wanted to talk to us about, Princess? A couple things, said Cadence with an indulgent smile. I have to admit, I was hoping for the chance to talk to you and Don for a little bit. Any particular reason? Asked Don, canting his head a bit. Not specifically, replied Cadence, but we haven't had a chance to really speak since you came up here and I've been looking forward to the opportunity. I know and like Scootaloo already, but my husband has spoken very highly of you, Don. Don blushed slightly and ducked his head. That's nice to hear. Cadence had to lift a hoof to her mouth in order to stifle her giggle at the colt's modesty. In any case, I've been hoping for the chance to get to know you. Would you be willing to talk for a little bit? Don and Scootaloo exchanged another glance. They had been looking for something to occupy their time in any case. Sure, I guess, said Scootaloo, what do you want to talk about? Oh, everything, said Cadence with a wistful smile as she guided them away from the ballroom and the dance floor, leading them outside into the gardens. Rarity savored the graceful tones produced by her dress as she sauntered down the hall. Such quiet was fairly welcome for a little bit. Granted, she was looking forward to joining her companions again, but the quiet of the unpopulated hallway was a welcome relief to the constant press of sound in the ballroom. Rarity had briefly excused herself from her conversation partners in order to attend to certain necessities. Perhaps she had indulged in the champagne a bit too much. But it was a special occasion, so Rarity figured that she was within her rights to indulge. In either case, after a swift trip to the powder room, she was now making her way back to the ballroom, humming contentedly as she considered her options. Perhaps Fancy Pants would be willing to accompany her to the dance floor, given that his wife wasn't in any state to do so. It would be fun and she knew Fleur wouldn't mind. Or, just maybe, she could solicit Coco Pommel's input on her dresses and see what adjustments and modifications the young mare might make. Rarity wasn't nearly so foolish as to assume that her designs were perfect and flawless. An outside perspective could prove invaluable, given what she was attempting in the future. Her thought process was interrupted by the sound of voices seeping out through a door that she was passing. Though it was rude to eavesdrop, Rarity's interest was hooked when she realized that she recognized both of those voices. Come on, cajoled the stallion, whom she almost immediately recognized as Shining Armor, the night's way too young for you to be lurking about in here. If it's all the same to you, I would rather stay here, replied the other stallion, his voice sending simultaneous shivers of recognition and revulsion down Rarity's spine. The only ponies currently out there on the floor that are worth having a conversation with happen to hate me with a passion, continued Prince Blueblood. Come on, said Shining, it's not that bad. You've already talked to Twilight about it. She promised to talk to her friends about your situation. Did she now? Wondered Rarity, raising an eyebrow. She hadn't realized that Twilight was on speaking terms with the biggest boor in Canterlot. It would have had to have been when she and Arkenstone had gone to Canterlot to research Dawn Lightwing's condition. However, Twilight had never mentioned Blueblood at all after returning. I can hope so, said Blueblood, but a simple conversation doesn't quite make up for a first impression like the one I gave. Well yeah, agreed Shining, but this is your chance to make a second and better impression. Do you really want to waste it? Why should I even bother? It's not as though I have any intention of building a partnership or forging a lasting relationship with any of those ponies. You don't have to think about that, said Shining, but there's no reason you can't make some friends blue. Fancy Pants and I are starting to worry. I know Arkenstone would worry too if Twilight wasn't giving him enough headaches as it is. You're always so cynical about other ponies you end up shoving them away. And why shouldn't I be? Demanded Blueblood, his tone irritable. You know as well as I do how ponies see me, regardless of what class they come from. All they ever seem to notice is Princess Celestia's nephew, Mr. Most Eligible Bachelor. That's what that one friend of Twilight's was clearly thinking about when she approached me back then. In spite of her own indignation, Rarity felt a quiver of guilt down in her stomach. It had been extremely inconsiderate of her to approach Blueblood, only thinking of his rank and nearly nothing else. Part of her objected that, where most mares would have calculated such an action sheerly for social gain, Rarity's interest had been almost purely romantic. But is that any better? A voice chimed in the back of her head. After all, did I really give a single though to Blueblood the pony, or was I too carried up in the idea of a prince sweeping me off my hooves into some fairy tale happy ending? She supposed that much was true. That doesn't exactly excuse the way he treated me though. Maybe so, said Shining, but I think there's one mare you feel differently about. Oh, where indignation had been simmering, curiosity had taken its place as Rarity pressed her ear up against the door, the promise of delicious gossip too engrossing to ignore. That's not important, protested Blueblood weakly, besides, it's not as though I can go up and talk to her. Come on now, said Shining, his cajoling tone back in place, she won't be playing the whole night through. This is your chance to have a real conversation with her, maybe even get a dance in while some pony else is playing on the stage. Don't be ridiculous, you know that would never be accepted. She may come from a very well-off family, but she's still a commoner and an earth pony to boot. Steel Flint was willing to commit murder over the fact that your sister, a mere knight, was willing to engage in such a relationship. How do you think the noble court would respond to a duke expressing such feelings? They won't like it, agreed Shining, they'll squall and pitch a tremendous fit like the overgrown foals that they are. But if you have the maturity to follow through on your feelings, then they don't have to matter. Cadance and I are with you. So is Fancy Pants. Above all else, you know that Celestia and Luna are on your side too. I'd like to see any of those fools try anything. You have your own means too, Blue. Right now, you're just using them as an excuse because you're afraid to try. Rarity could hear the hitch in Blueblood's voice. I wish I could, but how can I? Even if she doesn't care about my station, she almost certainly knows about the rest of my reputation. What could possibly convince her that I'm worth her time? Maybe honesty, said Shining, it worked wonders for Cadance and me. If you're honest with her about your feelings, then she might be willing to look past the things you've done to scare other mares away. She doesn't exactly have all that much reason to doubt you after all. As you pointed out, there's certainly no political gain in courting her, so that reason is out. But isn't she supposed to be involved with that DJ from Ponyville? Asked Blueblood in the voice of a stallion who clearly knew he had no hope of winning the argument and was feebly grasping at the last straws available to him. She could practically hear Shining Armor rolling his eyes. Not that I know of. From what I hear, they went to school together, but have hardly seen each other since. I haven't heard anything about either of them being interested in the other that way. Come on, enough excuses. Rarity found herself waiting with bated breath for Blueblood's answer. Once again, her conscience reminded her that she probably shouldn't be listening in on this conversation, but the subject was too interesting to ignore. Part of her still loathed Blueblood with a passion, but she was beginning to see that she had been at least partly wrong about him, partly. I suppose I could give it a try, admitted Blueblood, a nervous quaver in his voice. Are you sure it will work? Love's never sure, said Shining wryly. My wife's the princess of love, so you're getting this from some pony who knows. But the one thing that is sure is that doing nothing won't work. You need to get out there, take a risk, and give it your best shot. Be very well then, said Blueblood, his voice becoming softer. To her own surprise, Rarity could feel a tiny smile of triumph across her own face. Realizing that she should probably be on her way, she finally managed to pry herself away from the door. She headed down the hall at a brisk trot. She imagined that she'd see Blueblood again that evening, but she resolved to keep her distance. Even if she couldn't bring herself to hate the very sight of him anymore, any attempt to reconcile in this setting would be unbelievably awkward for both of them. And they could both do without that. True to her word, Cadance let the topic range far and wide, following her curiosity as she asked about Don's integration into Ponyville life, his encounters with hostile ponies both within the cult solar and without, his training and the experiences he'd had with his master. However, what seemed to interest her the most, naturally, was the progress of the relationship between Don and Scootaloo. She inquired about what they did together during their free time, how much time they spent together, where their interests overlapped and where they differed. She couldn't stop laughing when Scootaloo expressed her vexation about Don's pickiness, especially where the issue of sweet things was concerned. It drives me crazy, complained Scootaloo loudly. After everything that went on during Nightmare Night, he left all of his candy at the statue. All of it. I wouldn't have been able to eat it, replied Don levelly. You could have given it to me, said the filly, glaring at Don, who merely smirked. I like to think of it as doing your mother a favor. Cadance couldn't help it. She laughed loudly as Scootaloo thrust out her bottom lip mulishly and looked pointedly away from her cold friend, who was chuckling himself. Cadance was frankly amazed by the breadth of Don's experience. At the same age as Scootaloo and her two friends, he had already been through a great deal of hardship and had grown tremendously because of it. She could easily imagine that he was, at times, a difficult pony to get along with. However, he and Scootaloo seemed perfectly at ease together, able to enjoy each other's company and friendship, even enduring the odd disagreement with little difficulty. The two of them were surprisingly mature for their age, which gave Cadance a lot of hope for their future. Her eyes slipped to one of the clocks in the ballroom and she realized that her time was nearly up. It was time to usher the two young ones onto the next event. Thank you for talking with me, she said. I think I've occupied enough of your time now. Can you tell us if there's a place here for foals? Asked Scootaloo. There is, said Cadance. One of the side rooms has been set aside for the younger crowd. But the two of you are expected elsewhere. Both Scootaloo and Don raised their eyebrows. With a sly smile, Cadance pointed to a door, the one that Arkenstone had led Twilight through a little while earlier. You see, there are some ponies visiting who wanted to meet you specifically, Don. I know that they'd be happy to meet you too, Scootaloo. If you follow that hallway down, it's the third door on your right. Don and his filly friend exchanged a confused look for a second. All right, said Don, are you coming with us? Not right now, said Cadance, but I might drop by later. Trust me, I think you'll find this an interesting surprise. With a hesitant nod, Don and Scootaloo departed from Cadance and headed for the door. Watching them go, Cadance smiled to herself as a giddy feeling rose in her chest. What did you think? Asked Shining Armor as he trotted up to join his wife. They're a remarkable pair, said Cadence. They've formed a strong, healthy bond with each other. There's a great deal of trust, care, and affection that's rare, even among couples much older than they are. So, is it love? Asked Shining. Not yet, replied Cadence with a giggle. Right now, it's more of a mutual infatuation. Scootaloo looks up to and is a little in awe of Dawn, while Dawn has a deep respect for Scootaloo's potential as his student. But that bond will serve as the foundation for a strong and passionate love in the future. She turned to look at her husband. I think they'll be fine. That's good to hear, said Shining, leaning in to nuzzle his wife. You think they're gonna like the surprise? Oh, I bet they'll be at a loss for words. Let's see, here it is. Scootaloo and Dawn came to a stop outside the third door on the right after they had left the ballroom. The door was a large one, indicating that the room that lay beyond it was large as well. Scootaloo raised a hoof to push the door open, but stopped when Dawn hooked his foreleg over her own. What is it? She asked, glancing at the colt, finding him uncharacteristically tense. Dawn frowned, his eyes narrowing and his brow furrowing. I don't know, he admitted, I just feel something. Feel. Scootaloo spread her wings and tried to sense something from the other side of the door, using the narrow cracks between it and the walls and the floor. However, the picture was muddled and she couldn't get a clear idea of what was on the other side, though she could feel the presence of some other ponies, though she had no idea as to who. Dawn raised his right wing slightly, orienting the feathers toward the door, clearly trying to get a feel for what lay on the other side for himself. However, he had just as much difficulty as Scootaloo. Their wind sense was hampered by the nearly complete barrier between them and what lay on the other side. However, it wasn't his wind sense that had made Dawn cautious. I can't say exactly, he said, but I can feel the presence of other ponies. What other ponies? Asked Scootaloo, tensing up herself now. There was no way the cult Solar could have infiltrated this far into the palace without any pony realizing. I don't know, said Dawn, but they aren't ordinary ponies. They feel formidable. Scootaloo swallowed hard and turned her attention back to the door. Both of them jumped when the door let out a loud creak and began to swing open, forcing them to jump back. They sank into identical crouches, partially spreading their wings as carefully honed reflexes took over. However, they both froze when they saw who was waiting for them on the other side. Twilight Sparkle blinked as she stared down at the two foals. Dawn, Scootaloo. Twilight Sparkle. Scootaloo stared back up at the older mare. What are you doing here? Arkenstone brought me, said Twilight. You two must have been sent here too. Come in. Scootaloo and Dawn walked into the room, looking about nervously. It was another ballroom, much smaller than the main one. The torches that should have been illuminating the space were out and the entire room was bathed in darkness. Only the faint circle of light cast by Twilight's horn made things visible. Even then, it only illuminated a small portion of the space. To their surprise, Twilight wasn't the only pony there. Rainbow Dash! Exclaimed Scootaloo as she bounded up to her idol. Hey there, Squirt, said Rainbow as she stepped away from Soren to gently brush Scootaloo's mane. I guess you got invited here too. Yeah, said Scootaloo. Princess Cadence told me and Dawn that we should be here. She said that there were some ponies who wanted to meet us. Arkenstone said that too, said Twilight, but then he left after he brought me here. Well, said Rainbow, turning to her colt friend, what about it? Sorry, said Soren with an apologetic grin, but I've been told not to spoil the surprise. Surprise. The word had barely left Scootaloo's mouth when the quality of the air in the room changed. All of a sudden, the hairs of her coat stood on end and her entire body began to shiver as though she were standing on the surface of a thundercloud. Her wings instinctively stretched out, whether to fight or flee, she wasn't sure. Beside her, Dawn did the same, his own body tensing like a coiled spring as some kind of strange energy seemed to fill the room. Dawn's eyes cast about, trying to locate the source of the strange sensation and lock down its characteristics. However, it was so all-encompassing that he couldn't manage that. However, he was able to discern one thing about it. Its presence. The presence of some pony powerful. Indeed, the presence that filled the room seemed to make the air hum with energy. Slowly, Dawn's instincts felt the massive presence begin to divide and resolve itself into 6 distinct individuals. His ears twitched as he picked up the sound of hooves on the polished marble of the floor as some pony approached them slowly. Finally, a familiar figure stepped into the circle of light created by Twilight's magic. Arkenstone. Twilight sighed in relief and stepped towards the beige stallion. Don't scare me like that. I'm sorry, said Arkenstone, I'm afraid that one of us has something of a flair for the dramatic. She wanted to make a show of it since it's so rare for us to get together like this. We decided to indulge her. Twilight's eyes widened in shock. Us? You don't mean. Arkenstone nodded. That's correct. This is something of an auspicious occasion. As he spoke, the torches resting in their sconces on the pillars throughout the room's perimeter blazed into life, seemingly of their own volition. Even Twilight's practiced eye could only just barely discern the faint spark of magic leaping from one torch to another, lighting them all in turn. The light from the torches quickly spread out to illuminate the whole room, revealing the figures of 5 other ponies. Without further ado, said Arkenstone, allow me to introduce the members of the Celestial Order of Knights. Author's notes. Only a couple more chapters left before the end. Fleur and Fancy are absolutely adorable together. I somewhat based their interactions on my sister and her husband. Damn, even though I was totally okay with them getting married, it really throws me to have to keep reminding myself that they are, in fact, married. It's one of those situations where you hardly notice any change because it's clear that the wedding is simply a formality. Given that Cadence is the princess of love, it made sense to me for her holiday to be Hearts and Hooves Day. It also makes a certain amount of sense for her to be leery of the implications of the day, because one of the big complaints I hear about such holidays is the pressure it can put on established couples to do something significant with each other or one-up what they did last year. I imagine that would be a recurring source of frustration for Cadence. Next chapter, probably one of the last ponies you'd expect to be a knight. In the Presence of Power. Chapter 24, In the Presence of Power. Sheesh, muttered Soren, even I wasn't expecting this much drama. Knit, said Spitfire as she trotted up to join Arkenstone, I'll have to admit, it was a lot of fun. She grinned at Rainbow Dash. How are ya doing, newbie? Great, said Rainbow, a wide grin on her face as she greeted her captain. I'm really glad you're here. This party was getting boring really fast. Spitfire chuckled at Rainbow's words. That's certainly true, she agreed. She was dressed in a brilliant orange and red dress, her skirt seeming to have been woven from tongues of flame. The dress, combined with her mane being combed back, made her look completely beautiful as the colors of her dress seemed to dance in the light of the torches. So this is the rookie you've been going on about, commented another mare, trotting over to them. Looking at the mare, Rainbow found herself staring unabashedly. The pink Pegasus mare was older, much older than Spitfire. She might very well have been the oldest pony in the room. Interestingly enough, even though it was obvious that she was old, that didn't seem to detract from her appearance at all. In fact, if there were a picture next to the definition of the term, aging gracefully, it would probably be of this mare. Her pale pink coat did nothing to hide the slight wrinkles in her skin, particularly those at the corners of her eyes and lips, making it clear that she was a pony who smiled a lot, just like how she was smiling at Rainbow now. Contrasting with her coat were a light blue mane and tail, which helped to frame a pair of grayish-purple eyes. In spite of her age, there was no air of frailty about her, and her taut musculature and lithe form suggested that she was still in peak physical condition for a pony half as old as she was. Unlike Spitfire, this mare had chosen not to wear a dress and, in spite of the occasion, didn't seem to need it. There was an air of confidence about her that surpassed the need for any articles of clothing, and she seemed to glow with the radiance her own spirit as she proudly showed the 2 blue lightning bolts that decorated her flank. "You're staring," commented Spitfire wryly, moving in to nudge Rainbow in the ribs. "So am I," commented the other mare with a chuckle. "You mind introducing us?" "Not at all," said Spitfire. Gesturing towards the pink Pegasus, she said, "Rainbow, this is Firefly, the Knight of the Shining Heavens." "Wow," said Rainbow, "that sure is an impressive title." "It's annoying," muttered Firefly with a grimace, "it's so darn pretentious. That's what we get for letting our peers think up these things." Shrugging off her frustration, Firefly turned her full attention back to Rainbow and studied the younger mare intently. Rainbow got the distinct feeling, like she was a specimen under a microscope. Rainbow had an unsettling feeling that whatever this mare said next could decide the path of her future, for better or for worse. Finally, Firefly's face lit up in a happy smile and she began to chuckle. She wasn't kidding. "You certainly do seem to be everything that Spitfire said that you were." "Huh," Rainbow gaped for a second. "You could tell all that just by looking at me." "For some ponies, it's easier than others," said Firefly. "You have no reason to hide what kind of pony you are. You wear your nature proudly. Furthermore, your artistic friend, the one who made your dress, clearly sees it as well, given that she put your love for the sky so boldly on display." "Love for the sky," mused Rainbow, staring off into space as she pondered Firefly's words. In the meantime, Firefly turned to Spitfire. "I like her a lot. I'll do it." "Great," replied Spitfire with a cheerful grin. "What are they talking about?" Rainbow whispered as she leaned in towards Soren, the two of them being momentarily forgotten by the pair of chatting knights. "Remember when I told you that Spitfire had something special in mind for your training?" asked Soren. When Rainbow nodded, her explained, "Well, Firefly has been looking for a student for some time now. She's the most senior member of the knights currently serving, and she's been looking for some pony to teach her skills to, but not just any old Pegasus will cut it." "So they picked me?" asked Rainbow, a bit stunned by the idea that she'd somehow gained the approval of not just one, but 2 celestial knights. Soren nodded. "That's right. When you come to us in the spring, you're going to get a special training regimen from Firefly, rather than the usual one Spitfire gives most recruits." "That's great, but," Rainbow hesitated, "I'm still gonna be a Wonderbolt, right?" "Of course," said Soren with complete conviction, "we found you first. We have dibs after all. It's not her knighthood that Firefly wants to pass on to you. The whole celestial knight thing doesn't work like that. She just wants to pass on her skill to another pony before it's too late. I've heard it's one of the highest Pegasus arts in existence, something even more advanced than the Gale King." "In a sense," commented another mare, coming up behind them, "but it's not that the Gale King is inferior. If anything, Firefly's magic is the ultimate refinement of the principles behind the Gale King. But, like your cold friend said, it's not for every pony." Rainbow and Soren turned around to regard the newcomer, and Rainbow's jaw hit the floor as her eyes threatened to forcefully leap from their sockets. "BWHAAAA. Why. The mare in front of them flashed a cheeky grin at Rainbow, tossing her grayscale mane as she struck a pose, throwing her head back and spreading her wings back and out slightly, the very image of a Pegasus showing off. Her sand-colored coat was covered by a glittering, emerald green dress that hung somewhat loosely from her shoulders. She winked a cerise-colored eye, the same color as Rainbow's eyes in fact, at Rainbow. "What's the matter? You look like you've seen a ghost." Why, you're daring." Rainbow paused and brought her forehooves up to rub her eyes vigorously. She blinked fiercely as she lowered her hooves, but the mare standing in front of her was still there, looking exactly the same as before. "This can't be right. I must be dreaming. Soren, pinch me, quick." With a chuckle and an amused roll of his eyes, Soren shrugged before leaning in to lightly bite Rainbow's exposed shoulder. "Eep, that hurt. That means I'm not dreaming." "That's right," said the sandy mare, flashing that same wry grin, "you're not dreaming. You're hallucinating. I'm a figment of your imagination conjured up by the stuff Pinkie Pie spiked the punch with." "What, really?" Rainbow froze. Pinkie spiked the punch. Her wings snapped open. "Hold on, I haven't even drunk anything yet tonight." "Then you're hallucinating preemptively," suggested the mare again, once again flashing that cheeky grin of hers. "I'm not hallucinating," snapped Rainbow, getting up in the mare's face. "Who the hey are you?" "Daring do." Once again, Rainbow froze with shock. "Just kidding." A low growl rumbled out of Rainbow's throat. "Why I oughta." The mare couldn't help it. She threw her head back and let out a round of laughter that seemed to fill up the entire room. The sound was rich and resonant, suggesting that this was a mare who liked to laugh and enjoy herself and, above all else, didn't take herself too seriously. "Oh, you're just too cute. I may just have to steal you from Spitfire and Firefly." "All right, cut the manure," snapped Rainbow. "Who are you, really?" "Right," said the mare, "allow me to introduce myself. My name is Sparrowhawk. My fellow knights call me the Magpie." Rainbow raised an eyebrow. "Magpie. Perhaps she is interested in shiny objects." Rainbow jumped at the sound of Dawn's voice. Both Dawn and Scootaloo had walked up to join them. Sparrowhawk chuckled at Dawn's suggestion. "That's about the crux of it. I'm what you might call Celestia's seeker. Of all the knights, I'm the one who spends the most time abroad." "What do you do?" asked Rainbow. I track down lost artifacts, particularly dangerous magical ones, replied Sparrowhawk. You wouldn't believe how many of those things are just lying around, waiting for some pony to pick them up. I round them up so that the princess can box them up and hide them in her secret warehouse in wherever it is. Sounds like an interesting job, noted Dawn. Sounds like daring do, commented Scootaloo. Sparrowhawk shrugged. In a sense, I suppose it is daring do. I'm sure you noticed the resemblance. She struck another pose, once again tossing her multi-toned gray mane. However, the act of striking said pose caused the hem of her skirt to lift off the floor, giving her audience a view of the magnifying glass cutie mark that decorated her flank. You don't have the same cutie mark, Rainbow pointed out. Once again, Sparrowhawk laughed. Of course I don't, she replied. Daring do's a fictional character after all. I'm guessing that her fictional exploits have at least some basis in your reality, said Dawn, raising an eyebrow. You'd be right, said Sparrowhawk with a smirk. Are you the author? Demanded Rainbow, excitement bleeding through into her voice as she began to get uncomfortably close to the sand-colored mare. Afraid not, replied Sparrowhawk, edging back from Rainbow a little nervously, and it's a personal policy not to reveal her private information to crazed fangirls. She tends to dislike being badgered about when her next book is coming out. Oh come on, snapped Rainbow. Why don't we go get something to drink, suggested Soren carefully, resting a wing over Rainbow's back and guiding her away from the sardonic knight. Dawn glanced sidelong at Sparrowhawk, who was not trying very hard to restrain her giggles. You're toying with her, aren't you? I can't help it, said Sparrowhawk. She's so much fun and she has all these obvious buttons that I can't help but want to push. She threw a wink at Dawn. Scootaloo frowned and glared up at Sparrowhawk, who seemed not to notice. Instead, she turned and grinned down at the two foals. By the way, I've really been looking forward to meeting you kids. Arkenstone's been saying a lot about you too. It's rare for any of us to take such an interest in some pony. Scootaloo and Dawn both blushed slightly. In your impression? Asked Dawn. Sparrowhawk studied them intently for a moment. I like you too, she said finally, especially you, little lady. I get the feeling you've got a lot of potential. Me, gasped Scootaloo, her hoof going to her chest. Sparrowhawk studied Dawn's reaction at that moment. To her surprise, Dawn didn't look the slightest bit miffed that Scootaloo had apparently made a stronger impression than he had, nor did he look even the slightest bit depressed by that information. Rather, it looked as though he had been expecting that observation on some level. He even looked proud, as his gaze flickered to Scootaloo before returning to Sparrowhawk. Sparrowhawk's estimation of the colt went up a little more when she saw that. I guess that makes sense, she thought. He is the one teaching her after all. He would have been the first to see her potential. If I were to hazard a guess, she's got him beat in both talent and passion when it comes to the art. But he doesn't seem to mind in the slightest. If I'm right about that, then his true talent lies elsewhere. Sparrowhawk had an inkling as to just where that passion might lie, but decided to keep that information to herself. It would be more rewarding for Dawn to find it out on his own. In the meantime, Soren led Rainbow to a table set off to the side of the room. It was almost a miniature version of the big buffet table laid out in the main ballroom. However, the foods that decorated this one were simpler, less ornate, less fro, as Rainbow liked to think about it. It was clear that the knights were far less picky about the confections that they ate. She took a sip of the punch that Soren hoofed her and swallowed it, willing herself to calm down after having her feathers ruffled by the ornery mare that looked like her favorite book character. She wasn't so thick that she hadn't realized that Sparrowhawk was messing with her. She supposed she couldn't hold a grudge against the knight. It had all been in good fun and Sparrowhawk hadn't pushed things too far. All in all, she seemed to be a good pony, but Rainbow felt that she'd had enough teasing for a little while. So who do you want to meet next? Asked Soren. Who's left? Asked Rainbow, turning to regard the rest of the room. Her eyes wandered, picking out Twilight and Arkenstone as they chatted with. Hey, said Rainbow, is that Trixie's older brother? Soren immediately picked out who Rainbow was looking at and his eyes widened. At a bit of a loss for words, he decided to fall back in the tactics of a certain red stallion he'd become drinking buddies with back when he'd stayed in Ponyville. Yup. Is he wearing a dress? Yup. And he's making look good. Yup. Rainbow froze and turned to stare at her colt friend, who had frozen with that familiar look of a stallion who'd just been caught saying something very wrong. Soren looked back at her and quickly shrugged. What can I say? He really makes that look work. You'd never know he was a stallion. Turning away from Soren, Rainbow groaned and smacked her head with a hoof. Meanwhile, Twilight was, well, enjoying wasn't the word she'd use for her feelings regarding her conversation with Arcana. The stallion was by himself for the time being. Trixie had apparently gone off to the gala proper to take in the experience as a whole. It was her first time attending. I can't believe you're actually wearing that thing in public, muttered Twilight as she once again took in the sight of Arcana in his dress, the completed version of the one she had seen him modeling for Rarity. Scratch that, I can't believe Rarity actually made that for you. Well, she insisted after all, said Arcana, and since she went through the trouble, I could scarcely let her hard work go to waste, now could I? Twilight sagged and half glared at the svelte stallion. I don't think I can say anything to that. She looked around the room, taking in the sight of Spitfire and Firefly chatting casually while Dawn and Scootaloo talked with Sparrowhawk. Rainbow and Soren were coming over to where Twilight and Arcana were speaking, both of them looking just as baffled by Arcana's choice of garment as Twilight was. Letting out a sigh, Twilight turned back to Trixie's brother. Frankly, I'm amazed so many of you got together. Arcana chuckled. Well, it seemed like a decent idea. Arkenstone was coming with you, I was coming with Trixie, Spitfire was already slated to be here. Having me and Arkenstone here was rare enough in and of itself that Sunny thought it would be a good idea to invite every pony. Sunny. Twilight raised an eyebrow as she looked around in confusion. She suddenly remembered that, when she and Arkenstone had arrived, there had been 5 other ponies, including Arcana. But now, she only noticed 4. It's so nice to finally meet the great Twilight Sparkle in the flesh. Twilight shrieked as the taunting voice seemed to emerge from every single section of the room all at once. Dawn's reaction was instantaneous, sinking down into a battle-ready crouch with his wings spread, ready for an attack from any direction. Scootaloo backed up against him, her own wings spread as she looked around warily. Soren and Rainbow both tensed, but Rainbow relaxed when she felt Soren's wing over her back give her a reassuring squeeze as he smiled at her. Twilight expected the knights to react similarly. However, they instead merely looked annoyed. Even Arkenstone, usually so calm and relaxed, swished his tail impatiently. Are you finished with the dramatics? He asked coolly, his ears swiveling around. The torches seemed to blaze brighter, the light emitting from their flames washing out most of the details in the room and throwing every pony, their shadows in particular, into stark relief. The multiple sources of light created multiple shadows that stretched out from every pony in different directions. Twilight failed to see the figure of a mare rising up out of her own shadow, coming up directly behind her. You know, the mare whispered into Twilight's ear, whenever I can be bothered to talk to Celestia, she just won't shut up about you. Eek. Twilight spun around to face the mare whispering into her ear, but the strange mare seemed to vanish into the light without a trace. In the next second, it was Dawn and Scootaloo who were subjected to the mare's attention. Dawn's feathers twitched and he immediately whirled about, even as the mare seemed to condense out of the light around them like a shadow without an owner. Dawn kept himself positioned so that Scootaloo was slightly behind him as she too tried to orient on the unknown mare. From what I've heard, you two seem to have rare potential. The mare's features were obscured by both the light and the darkness, but her audience was fairly sure that she was smirking. I don't see much worth remarking on. Suddenly, the light from the torches returned to a normal level. The mare once again dissolved into a cloud of swirling darkness which drifted over halfway between the foals and Twilight before congealing back into the form of a mare. Her coloration was similar to Spitfire's in a sense. Her yellow coat was offset by a mane of red and yellow stripes, along with a matching tail. The mare's cutie mark was the symbol of the sun, much like Celestia's but divided into light and dark halves. Who are you? Asked Twilight, her mood resting somewhere between angry and terrified. Something about this mare unnerved her, but the strange mare's demeanor was also grating in a much more serious sense than Twilight even found Arcana to be, something almost personal. Arkenstone stepped forward with a resigned sigh. Allow me to introduce our sixth member, Sunset Shimmer, otherwise known as the Shadowlight. The mare identified as Sunset Shimmer rolled her cyan eyes and smirked mockingly at Twilight. To be honest, I'm amazed you've never heard of me. Did Princess Celestia never tell you about me? Twilight shook her head. I don't recall her mentioning any pony by your name even once. Sunset's smirk melted into an angry scowl. It figures. She's always been like that. What are you talking about? Demanded Twilight. You should be more respectful to your upper-class mare, said Sunset in a haughty tone, though Celestia ultimately flunked me. You were Princess Celestia's personal student, demanded Twilight. One of them anyway, replied Sunset coolly. You didn't think you were all that special, did you? Celestia's taken on several such students over the years. Twilight's brow furrowed. She could remember the name of one student in particular. Given the time frame, she wondered if Morning Star had been Sunset's classmate. Sunset began to prowl clockwise around Twilight, and now you've become Arkenstone's filly friend. You must be so proud of yourself, especially after he brought you in here to parade you around to the rest of us. Twilight shrunk back from Sunset, nervously pressing herself up against Arkenstone's side. Sunset's demeanor upset Twilight more than her words did. Twilight could feel a simmering resentment from Sunset, almost as though the prickly mare hated her with a passion. That's enough, Sunset, said Arkenstone, his tone a low rumble that seemed to make the stones beneath their hooves tremble. He stepped forward, keeping himself between Twilight and Sunset, cutting off the aura of animosity that was unnerving Twilight. Instead, a growing tension enveloped the room. For a moment, Twilight was afraid the two of them were going to start fighting. A flash of pink and blue crossed her field of vision and Firefly suddenly appeared between both Arkenstone and Sunset. Before either of them could react, Firefly lashed out with her hooves and smacked them against the foreheads of the two other knights, resulting in a loud crack echoing through the room as Arkenstone and Sunset both backed down, nursing identical bruises. Twilight noted that Firefly had clearly taken care to avoid striking Sunset's horn. Unbelievable, you two, said Firefly in a stern, almost motherly tone that would have made Princess Celestia proud, the first time that we're together in years and the only thing you can do is squabble like a pair of foals. Don't make me put you two in time out. Especially you. She whirled on Sunset, who now looked less menacing and more like a pouting filly. What have I told you about antagonizing ponies needlessly? Whatever is between you and Celestia is not her fault. If you and the princess can't work it out between the two of you, then that's not her problem. Don't go dragging some pony into this just because you're jealous. That's probably exactly why Celestia never told Twilight about you. Sunset let out a snort and looked away from Firefly's intense gaze. Fine, she puffed. She turned and began to wander away. Don't think you can leave, Firefly shouted after her. This party was your idea, that means you're obligated to see it through to the end. A dismissive lash of the tail was all the acknowledgement that Sunset gave Firefly's words as she continued to walk away. Firefly let out a sigh and turned back to Twilight and Arkenstone. Please forgive Sunset for her attitude. I don't know the full details myself, but I know that she and Princess Celestia had a serious falling out. I see, said Twilight nervously, casting a glance at the retreating Sunset Shimmer. She wasn't exactly surprised to find out that Celestia had another student. Part of her wanted to go after Sunset and ask if she knew anything about Morning Star. However, doing so would require worming her past the very prickly issue of whatever lay between Sunset and Princess Celestia, not to mention having to explain how she knew about Morning Star when every trace of his existence had been wiped from records both public and private. But there was something else that Twilight was curious about. Sunset's magic was completely different from anything Twilight had ever seen before. The way Sunset had melted out of shadow and into light made it almost seem as though she had been made of magic herself. Could she be? I'm sure you noticed, said Arkenstone, but Sunset Shimmer is a master of the still way. Firefly nodded in agreement. Extinguish the self, embrace the essence of nothingness and become one with your own magic. She's probably the foremost master of the still way in all of Equestria right now. Wow, breathed Twilight. Still, that attitude was her embracing nothingness. Seemingly reading her thoughts, Arcana chuckled. Nothingness is not such a simple concept to grasp. It is not something as simple as erasing your emotions. Twilight frowned and thought things over for a moment. Excuse me, she said softly, peeling herself away from Arkenstone for the first time that night and heading off after sunset. Arkenstone lifted a hoof to follow her, but stopped as Firefly's wing extended to block him. Let them work it out themselves, she said in a sage tone. Sunset doesn't really hate your filly friend, but it was an easy way to work out her frustrations. They have sufficient common ground that I think they'll be able to come to some sort of peace, added Arcana, only to freeze as the other two gave him disbelieving looks. What? It doesn't feel right to hear something so wise and considerate come out of your mouth, said Arkenstone. What he said, added Firefly. Arcana glared at them as Rainbow Dash and Soren both began to laugh at his consternation. Well, you two seem to be getting along well, observed Cadance as she and Shining Armor came across Caramel and Fluttershy. The two of them had been enjoying an evening stroll through the gardens. With a little advice from a friendly groundskeeper, Fluttershy had finally been able to entice some of the exotic and rare animals found in the gardens over so that she could speak with them. Though Caramel had essentially been left out one half of the various conversations, the look of sheer bliss on Fluttershy's face was more than enough to keep him happy. Even though it was in the middle of winter, the gardens looked as though it were nothing more than a warm, summer night. Many of the exotic creatures and plants that populated the gardens came from warm, even tropical climes and would have fared poorly during the equestrian winter. To counter this, wards had been laid around the gardens to maintain a warm temperature, regardless of the season. Fluttershy blushed profusely at Cadance's comment. Thank you very much, she said. She paused to look around. By the way, have you seen Dawn and Scootaloo? I haven't seen them all evening. Scootaloo's mother is probably getting worried too. Cadance giggled. Don't worry. Right now, Dawn and Scootaloo are attending a special gathering. Since you're Dawn's mother, I don't see why you couldn't join them. She gave Fluttershy the directions to the room where the knights had gathered. Thank you, said Fluttershy, bobbing her head in gratitude towards Cadance before turning to trot towards the room in question. Caramel fell in behind Fluttershy, but not before casting one last look over his shoulder at Cadance. To his surprise, the Princess of Love met his gaze and threw him a playful wink. The stallion hadn't thought it possible for his heart to feel any lighter than it already had. But he was practically floating off the ground as he drifted after Fluttershy. I guess things are working out pretty well between them, mused Shining as he watched the couple go. Oh, they most certainly are, agreed Cadance. Shining smirked at his wife. And guess who I just managed to coax out of hiding? Did you really? Asked Cadance, her eyes widening. At that moment, the music coming from the main ballroom changed. The other three members of the quartet fell silent as Octavia's cello sounded out by itself, a beautiful, deep, haunting melody that drifted across the audience of ponies, who had stopped in the midst of what they were doing to listen to the singular song being played by the gray mare's skilled hooves. She played with an incredible intensity that drew every pony's attention and made it clear that this was not music they were meant to dance to, but rather, it was music that demanded their fullest attention. Shining and Cadance listened, as spellbound as everyone else. Only when the final strains of the melody faded away and the quartet once again resumed their typical ballroom music did the two of them snap out of the daze Octavia's music had inspired. There's only one reason she would have done that, said Cadance slyly. With a sigh, Shining reached into the pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a few bits which he hoofed over to his wife. You win, he groaned, there's just no beating you. Cadance let out a victorious giggle. Not where love is concerned anyway. The spare ballroom being used by the knights for their gathering was situated on the same level as the main ballroom. However, because of its position, the back doors, rather than opening up into the gardens, instead opened into a balcony that looked out over the sheer cliffs of the mountain and across the foothills and valleys below. Sunset shimmer stared out over the vista, its stunning beauty seemingly lost on her. She was dressed now, clad in a silky, slinky crimson gown that accentuated her enticing figure. If she joined the main party, she would probably be knocking over stallions left and right. May I join you? Sunset turned to regard the source of the timid request. I don't see why not, she said, doing her best to keep a haughty tone. It's not like this is my palace after all. I don't have any right to dictate what parts of it you can and can't go to. Yeah, agreed Twilight as she trotted out to join Sunset. That would be Princess Celestia's prerogative, I guess. The wards placed around the palace grounds kept everything a constant, comfortable temperature, even in the dead of winter, so there was no discomfort from the night air as they surveyed the snow-covered expanse in front of them. Sunset winced visibly at Twilight's words. She let out a tired sigh and leaned forward to rest her chin on the railing. I'm sorry about earlier, she said. I guess I'm not really over that. A long time ago, I thought that mastering the still way would help me get over my resentment, but it's still there. Why would you think that? Asked Twilight. Because that's what attaining nothingness is supposed to do, said Sunset. It's supposed to allow you to find peace with yourself so that you don't have to deal with anger and resentment and all that crap. But that's not what it's about. The heart feels what it feels. Embracing nothingness is about accepting what you feel and learning how to not let it control you. It sounded like you let your feelings control you back there, commented Twilight. Not at first, said Sunset. At first I was just going to poke a little fun at you, try to ruffle that colt's feathers and see how he handled me. One of the best ways to get a feel for a pony is to see what makes them angry and then what happens when you actually get them angry. But I'm guessing the fact that Princess Celestia never told me about you made your emotions a bit harder to control, ventured Twilight. Sunset sighed again. Yeah, that's pretty much it. In the end, I threw it all away to master the still way, but being Celestia's student had been a big portion of my life. For her to never acknowledge it, not even to another one of her precious students, irks me. What happened? Asked Twilight. What made you so angry at her that you cast away everything she taught you? It's a long story, said Sunset, but the long and short of it was that I didn't meet her expectations. I was a different mare back then. Only two things really mattered to me, Celestia's approval and the perks that came with it. But Celestia was never really happy with me, no matter how difficult the spells I managed to master were or how advanced the theories I developed became, it just didn't seem to be what she was looking for. I think she was looking for some kind of sign that I was meant to be something more. Something more. Twilight thought that over for a second before her eyebrows shot sharply upwards. You mean, something like an element of magic? Sunset shrugged. Maybe. I can't even say that for sure. It's impossible to get a straight answer about something like that out of Celestia. She never wants to tell ponies straight out what she has planned for them. She always wants them to work things out for themselves. Only, sometimes the answer is something you just can't work out. Thinking about the test Celestia had once set for her to save the Crystal Empire, Twilight could understand the sentiment at least a little. You think she was grooming you to be the element of magic, but that she was disappointed when she thought you might not be it. Sunset nodded. The problem is, I'm not sure Celestia truly understood what the element of magic was, much less how it worked or how to make it appear. I think that she was operating off the basic assumption that because of the element's name, if she picked and nurtured ponies with substantial magical talent, then one of them was bound to be the wielder of that element. Turning her eyes back out over the balcony, Sunset directed a vacant gaze away from the palace. I guess she was right. I don't think so, said Twilight, smiling at Sunset. I can honestly say, having used the element of magic twice, that I still don't fully understand how it works. I'm pretty sure that, even if what you said is what Princess Celestia thought, it's not correct. Sunset's gaze snapped back to Twilight in an instant, staring wide-eyed at the younger mare. She'd always thought that from everything Celestia had said about Twilight that Twilight Sparkle would never dare question her mentor's judgment. It's just that the impression I've had is that the power that the elements of harmony isn't magic in the way that we understand it, continued Twilight. When I confronted Nightmare Moon, I recognized the things that made my friends their respective elements. But, in retrospect, the things that made me realize that were so small and tiny that, had they not been in the context of that incident, I wouldn't have even noticed, much less recognized their significance. After thinking about it for a very long time, I came to a certain conclusion. Twilight took a deep breath. I concluded that the elements of harmony could actually be wielded by any pony. Sunset's jaw dropped and she gaped unashamedly at Twilight. What? You can't be serious. The elements of harmony are one of, if not the most powerful force in the world. An empowered alicorn like Nightmare Moon was laid low with a single blast. You turned Discord, the god of chaos himself, who couldn't even be touched by the mundane forces of this world, to stone in the blink of an eye. There's no way that such a mighty power could be wielded by just any pony. Of course, not just any pony, replied Twilight. Only ponies who embody the element's nature could possibly hope to wield them. Only a pony who could give freely of herself without counting the cost when it really counts could hope to wield generosity. Only a pony who could respond with compassion, even towards something that inspires fear and anger, could hope to use kindness. Only a pony who has the heart to remain true to the things that are really important could hope to carry loyalty. Only a pony who genuinely seeks to lift the hearts and spirits of those around her could bear laughter. And only a pony who knows that the importance of speaking and recognizing the truth could command honesty. But my friends, the other bearers of the elements, they aren't perfect paragons of what those elements represent. Rarity's been selfish in the past. Fluttershy is, admittedly rarely, capable of giving in to her anger. Rainbow Dash has had her loyalties divided and failed to understand what's really important. Even Pinkie Pie has occasionally forgotten that the point of laughter is to enable ponies to enjoy themselves. And Applejack's occasionally told lies, some of the worst to herself. Twilight shivered at a fairly recent memory of that last occasion. The point is, my friends, even though they're the bearers of their elements, aren't perfect ponies. If anything, they're perfectly ordinary ponies. A mare who can perform the legendary sonic rainboom, a Pegasus who can speak the language of animals, the foremost fashion designer and artisan in Equestria, the heir to the most powerful agricultural clan in the nation, and Pinkie Pie, daughter ordinary ponies. Sunset raised a skeptical eyebrow. Twilight couldn't quite contain her giggle. Of course they are, she said, they're ordinary ponies who can do extraordinary things, really extraordinary in Pinkie's case. What's important is that, when it really counts, they can embrace the things that represent their elements. That's what gives them the power to wield the elements. And, if that's the case, then any pony could wield the elements of harmony, so long as they truly endorse and exhibit the qualities of harmony that the elements represent. She smiled at Sunset. You could wield an element, if you're willing to embrace those things. What about magic? Asked Sunset. Now it was Twilight's turn to shrug. Magic is ambiguous, at least, as far as I can tell. I haven't quite figured it out all the way. She turned to look back out over the balcony again. But what I think is that magic doesn't really represent magic, in the sense that we unicorns think about it. I think that it represents something more potent and important. What do you mean? Twilight frowned and narrowed her eyes thoughtfully. I don't like to put too much thought in it because I'm always afraid of letting it go to my head, but I've been called the most powerful mage in Equestria since Starsworld the Bearded. I have 3 principles in multiple fields, 4, if you count the honorary one. But none of that was ever just me. I would never have gotten this far if it hadn't been for Princess Celestia taking me under her wing. I would never have obtained those principles without the knowledge and experience of my teachers and other students before me to build off of. And I would never have had any of that at all if my parents hadn't put their livelihoods on the line to help me to gain admittance to the school for gifted unicorns. If Princess Celestia hadn't completely paid for my schooling, the tuition and various other fees would have beggared them. Likewise, if I hadn't met those 5 ponies in Ponyville and if they hadn't come with me into the Everfree Forest, I wouldn't have ever realized what the elements of harmony meant and I wouldn't have ever obtained the element of magic. We would never have succeeded against Nightmare Moon or Discord. All those accomplishments, many of which are attributed to me alone, especially here in Canterlot, are things I would have never been able to do on my own. But rather than thinking of that as a weakness, my theory is that that is the true form of magic. No matter how great a mage a unicorn might be, she'd never be great without learning from others. Even if you sought knowledge on your own, that knowledge comes from other sources that you then build off of. That's what real magic is. It's the bonds and connections with others that shape our lives and guide our paths, which is why magic didn't appear until I'd realized the truth about the other elements. It's the keystone for the elements as a whole, but it's nothing on its own without the power of the others. If that's the case, then any pony who could realize that is more than capable of using the element of magic. Twilight turned and grinned sheepishly at Sunset. That's my theory anyway. Sunset stared silently at Twilight for a moment, the gears in her head turning fiercely as she fought to comprehend what she'd just heard. I think I now understand why Celestia picked her. Slowly, Sunset's lips curled up into a smile. You really are some pony special, she said finally. Can you forgive me for those things I said earlier? Of course I can, said Twilight, reciprocating Sunset's smile with one of her own. You're my precious upper-class mare after all. True enough, agreed Sunset with a laugh. Come on, we should get back to the others. The two of them left the balcony and head back into the ballroom, where the others were waiting. Twilight was surprised to see that Fluttershy and Caramel had joined the gathering. She guessed they'd been trying to track down Dawn and Scootaloo. The couple were now speaking with Firefly. Fluttershy seemed to be surprisingly animated, given her normal shyness around unfamiliar ponies. However, Twilight guessed that Firefly's gentle, motherly nature was something that reached out to the butter-colored Pegasus. Twilight and Sunset had barely taken 2 steps into the ballroom when they were approached by Sparrowhawk, who was grinning slyly at them. So, did you two kiss and make up? Twilight and Sunset blushed brilliantly. I'm not the one here that swings that way, Magpie, snapped Sunset. Oh, come on, protested Sparrowhawk, slinking over to throw a foreleg around Twilight's withers. You can't tell me you don't find this little cutie attractive. Twilight's blush intensified, especially when she felt Arkenstone pressing up on her other side. Go get your own filly friend, reprimanded the beige stallion, flashing Twilight an uncharacteristically playful smile of his own. This one's mine. You could at least share, muttered Sparrowhawk, puffing out her cheeks as she pulled away. You could always take me, suggested Arcana, coming up to them. I've been told I greatly resemble a mare. Maybe that would be good enough for your tastes. Sparrowhawk made a gagging noise and let her tongue stick out. Ew, please, not in a million years, you crazy cross-dresser. Come on now, chided Firefly, moving from her conversation with Fluttershy and Caramel. Let's try to all get along. You keep out of this, Grandma, retorted Sparrowhawk. Firefly's eyelid twitched. Grandma. Elders should just embrace their age and nap quietly, added Sunset. In fact, why don't you just go to the retirement home already? Twilight shivered as she suddenly felt a surge of energy from the extremely youthful and not in any way elderly Pegasus as she turned a grin on the other knights that was almost predatory. My, said Firefly, such impudent foals, As your elder, I suppose it falls to me to teach you some respect. Twilight pried herself away from Arkenstone and Sparrowhawk, doing her best to distance herself from the conflict that was brewing. She stepped over to where Rainbow and Soren were standing with Dawn and Scootaloo, all of them watching the fabled guardians of Equestria's safety squabbled like a group of foals with varying degrees of confusion. They were quickly joined by Fluttershy and Caramel, who looked on with a similar degree of bamboozlement. Already, Spitfire was rushing in to join the fray as well. Arkenstone wasn't kidding when he said that they didn't really get along, mused Twilight as she watched the knights bicker and tease one another. Fortunately, no pony had come to blows just yet. Still, they seemed close to each other, in a sense. She'd seen this before, at Applejack's family reunions. She'd watched distant relatives who rarely saw one another trade warm embraces and good-spirited barbs in equal measure. In a sense, she supposed that the knights were a family in their own way. At that moment, looking at the 6 of them, the stunning momentousness of the occasion settled into her stomach. She was looking at the members of the Celestial Order of Knights, 6 of the most powerful and dangerous ponies in all of Equestria and, possibly, the world beyond it as well. These were ponies with the power to shake the earth, make the skies roar, and put entire armies into flight. How truly rare and amazing it was that they were all gathered here in this place at once. The situation was different from what she could have imagined. Very different, she concluded ruefully as she watched Firefly put an agitated Sparrowhawk in a headlock and began to vigorously ruffle the younger Pegasus' mane as Sparrowhawk twisted and writhed but was completely unable to pry herself loose from her tormentor. At that moment, something clicked in Twilight's head. 6. There are only 6 of them here. Carefully, Twilight stepped forward and approached the bickering group. Arcana, you and I are never going to agree on anything. Sunset was shouting as Twilight came closer. By the way, said Twilight, having to shout a little to make herself heard over the din, I've been wondering. What's the 7th night like? The response was instantaneous. All 6 of the ponies in front of her froze on the spot. At once, they grimaced identically. Twilight remembered Arkenstone giving her the same expression the last time she'd brought up the last of the Celestial Knights. Him, said Firefly. He's the worst, every pony said in unison. Twilight and her friends all gaped at the knight's response. All 6 of them gave the exact same answer. Arcana turned to Sunset. We agreed. I don't understand, said Twilight, blinking and tilting her head. What do you mean by that? Arkenstone managed to shake off the revulsion that Twilight's question had apparently stirred up within him. Well, we knights tend not to get along perfectly with each other, but Swift Stride is a special case. What do you mean? What Arkenstone's saying is that Swift is a jerk, replied Sparrowhawk with a loud snort. In fact, he's the only one of us who makes a point of being a jerk. He's a liar, said Firefly with a stern frown. He's a thug, added Spitfire. He's a thief, said Sparrowhawk. He's a dick, groused Sunset. Sunset would know about that last one, said Arcana. Shut up. Twilight still couldn't make sense of what she was hearing. Arkenstone chuckled sheepishly and gently pressed up against her side. Remember when I said that we all have titles that we've given one another? Swift Stride is probably the knight with the most titles out of all of us. None of them are very flattering. He's been known as Swift Stride, the Mad Bomber, Swift Stride, the Laughing Mad, even Swift Stride, the Lost Cause. We've given him too many to count really. Arkenstone slowly shook his head. However, I've always thought that the title that suited him best is the one that Princess Celestia herself bestowed upon him. What title is that? Asked Twilight. Swift Stride, the False. Achoo, 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 achoo. The earth pony paused, his hooves sinking into the deep snow as he reached back to pull out a hoofkerchief and wipe his nose clear of the splattered snot before it could freeze to his muzzle. Taking a deep breath, the stallion blew his nose into the hoofkerchief to clear away the remnants of the sneeze that had been left behind. Lowering the cloth, the stallion glanced at it one last time before tossing it away into the wilderness. The stallion shook his head vigorously, waving the spikes of his grayish-white mane through the air. He was dressed in a black outfit of loose-fitting silk that covered him from shoulders to haunches, complete with loose sleeves that ran down all 4 of his legs, leaving a hole for his tail to swish through the air behind him. As such, his head was the only part of him visible that displayed the khaki color of his coat. Up close, it was difficult to discern the color of his eyes given that he habitually squinted so tightly that they seemed closed most of the time. Around his barrel, he'd wrapped a long, white sash the ends of which trailed behind him like a pair of extra tails. Swift Stride rubbed his muzzle with his bare hoof one last time and sniffled. Geez, some pony must be talking some serious smack about me. He looked upwards and noted the position of the moon relative to the horizon. Sunny's little party should be in full swing right now, so it's probably those girls. He chuckled. Well, it's nice to know they're thinking of me at least. Maybe I should've dropped in on them after all. It would have been a nice surprise. After thinking it over for a moment, he barked out a sharp laugh. Nah, they're probably happy that I'm not there. Lowering his gaze from the sky, Swift grinned widely at what laid before him. Besides, I should report to my new boss. His eyes homed in on the dome shape that rose out of the otherwise barren, uninhabited terrain ahead of him, a low, stout building made from bricks carved out of granite. Time to do her radiance's will. Quote. The false? Asked Twilight. Arkenstone nodded slowly. He's unique amongst the knights in that he specializes in deception and misdirection. He's a tricky, dangerous fighter and you can never be sure of yourself when he's around. That doesn't sound like what a knight would do at all, said Twilight pensively. It certainly seemed different from the others. I suppose he is, said Arkenstone. However, the most important thing is that, without question, I believe that Swift Stride is the strongest of the celestial knights, in many ways. The strongest knight, repeated Twilight softly. I wonder what he's like. As I told you once before, said Arkenstone with a wince, I hope you never have to find out. Author's notes. Without further ado, the knights, ladies and gentlemen. I imagined that they were somewhat different than what you expected. I'll admit, I had entertained the idea of making Cheese Sandwich one of the knights. Some of you probably think he was the better choice, but I ultimately settled on Sunset Shimmer. Keep in mind that Equestria girls and the backstory surrounding it have not occurred in this setting. So Sunset Shimmer did not flee through a magic mirror into a land of technicolored apes only to come back years later to try and steal the element of magic. I intend to explore her backstory in a side story to this series later on, something that'll explain the circumstances of her falling out with Celestia and how she came to be a master of the Still Way. Only one chapter left. Next chapter, some good news, some bad. Homeward Bound. Chapter 25, Homeward Bound. The small side party to the Winter Gala continued on late into the night until both Dawn and Scootaloo were struggling to keep their eyes open. With a fond coo, Fluttershy volunteered to escort the foals back to their rooms. She and Caramel were feeling ready to turn in themselves. After they left, Rainbow Dash and Soren returned to the main party, while the rest of the knights excused themselves from the gathering, one by one. Finally, Twilight and Arkenstone were left to make their way back to their quarters on their own. Back at the main gala, every pony managed to enjoy themselves or find something to amuse themselves with. Perhaps one of the most shocking developments was the sight of Prince Blueblood dancing happily with Octavia on the one occasion she'd stepped down from the stage. It was an interesting development that set several tongues to wagging. The Winter Gala continued on through the night and into the early hours of the morning as ponies danced and chatted with each other. However, eventually, all good things must come to an end. The gala was no exception and, with the moon low on the horizon, ponies began to make their way back to their homes. Coco Pommel hummed cheerfully, prancing with surprising energy, in spite of the obscene hour. Even though she was an earth pony, she felt as though she could fly. Her hooves were light and she wanted to dance and giggle all night long, until the morning sun wiped the last of the stars from the sky. She had every reason to be happy after all. I've done it, she squealed to herself, I get to work with Miss Rarity in Ponyville. This is so amazing. An extra bonus would be that she was leaving Canterlot behind. Once, when she'd been working in Manhattan, Equestria's capital had seemed like the holy grail to fashion designers like herself. If you became recognized enough, you would be recognized by the Canterlot elite. Your designs would be worn by nobles to important functions. You'd set up shop in Canterlot to cater to them directly and, from there, set the trends for the rest of the nation. That had been what every pony in the business had been saying, what Coco herself had always been thinking. But, after her experiences, Coco had come to the conclusion that she would be happy to put Canterlot behind her. She'd had more than enough of the nobility in their ways. They were haughty and lived and breathed the myth of their own superiority on the basis of their birth alone. They regarded commoners and earth ponies like her as little more than dirt and cheap labor to be exploited as much as possible. Viscount Eventide had treated her as little more than a slave and Baron Elderflower had given her the impression that he'd seen her as nothing more than a pawn. With this apprenticeship to Rarity, Coco could say goodbye to Canterlot, goodbye to the nobles and their self-serving games, and goodbye to Pearl and Bluestreak. That last thought alone carried a feeling of relief that outweighed everything else. Coco imagined that it would feel odd for a little while. She'd gotten used to having Perlin hang around, but she was sure that she wouldn't miss him once he was gone. I'll be safe and free, thought Coco. She'd heard about the colt that lived in Ponyville, even seen him at a distance when she'd gone to the palace to help with the costumes and at the Winter Gala. She'd heard how he'd faced off against Griffin warriors, unicorn enforcers, and even a trained assassin. With him there, it was unlikely that Perlin would ever be able to bother her again without running into Dawn Lightwing first. You seem in high spirits. Coco sagged at the sound of Perlin's voice as the young stallion landed behind her with barely a whispering rasp of metal as his mithril wings settled back beneath his cloak. She thought with a small degree of petulance. Coco turned to face Perlin, whose presence served as a disturbing reminder that she wasn't free of him just yet. Her legs shivered a little at the sound of Perlin's voice, but that could have easily been excused by the evening cold of the mountain city. Why yes, she said tentatively, agreeing with his statement. What troubled her more than his presence was the expression on his face. Perlin did not look happy. Under normal circumstances, he had a chipper attitude and an upbeat demeanor that belied the casual ease with which he could use his wings to carve up ponies like roasts for a griffin's table. However, none of that attitude appeared on Perlin's face now. Instead he appeared uncharacteristically serious, solemn even, as though he was the bearer of bad news. Given that Perlin was bad news in his own right, the fact that he might be conveying bad news made Coco's stomach churn. Did you have a fun time at the gala? Asked Perlin in a conversational tone. Why yes, I did, replied Coco, too nervous to try for any answer more verbose. Perlin lowered his head and averted his eyes slightly to the side. The gesture surprised Coco a little. He'd always gone out of his way to be polite and even to try and tone down the threat of his presence around her. But now, he seemed almost ashamed. Then I'm guessing that your work made quite the impact on Miss Rarity then, said Perlin softly. Coco blinked, remembering how happy she'd been to receive Rarity's approval. The memory helped buoy her current mood and she managed a small smile. Yes, she really liked it. Every pony was very impressed by my work, even Marquis Fancy Pants and his wife. Then I suppose that you'll be leaving for Ponyville soon, said Perlin softly. Coco opened her mouth to answer, but the voice caught in her throat, her response dying a messy death on her tongue as the full impact of Perlin's words sunk in. He knew Coco wouldn't have necessarily put it past him to follow her around, given how much he stalked her already, and overheard the conversation she and Lockstitch had with Rarity. However, the way he phrased it made her realize that something was different. He didn't know because he'd heard Rarity make the offer, but rather that he suspected that Rarity had made it and Coco had accepted, which meant. What, exactly? Perlin said nothing and merely watched with that strange, forlorn expression as Coco worked to piece things together inside her head. She had Baron Elderflower to thank for her current position as Lockstitch's apprentice. After their conversation in the Crystal Caverns, the Baron had arranged for Coco to be placed with the aging Lockstitch. Coco briefly recalled how Lockstitch had willingly put off her own retirement to accept Coco's apprenticeship. It was unquestionably a mark of how much potential Lockstitch saw in Coco's skills, but it also created a situation where Lockstitch would be willing to pass Coco's apprenticeship to a more suitable pony if the opportunity arose, especially if it was a pony that Coco herself idolized. More importantly, Lockstitch was commissioned to produce the costumes for the Heart's-Warming Eve pageant shortly after Coco entered her shop. Had Baron Elderflower been behind that as well? Had he been aiming for an opportunity for Rarity to see Coco's skills for herself, also that Coco would get the opportunity to work under Rarity at the Carousel Boutique? In other words, the Baron had created a situation where a pony with ties to him would be working with Rarity in Ponyville. Because Miss Rarity is close to Miss Twilight Sparkle, that was what was important after all. Elderflower had killed the Viscount Eventide and 2 score of his guards by proxy, since Perlin was the one who'd done the actual killing, as a consequence of the struggle for control over Twilight Sparkle. The truth hit Coco hard and fast. By accepting the opportunity to work under Rarity in Ponyville, she hadn't escaped Elderflower's influence but rather played right into his hooves. Why you? She stammered, her voice barely a whisper as she looked at Perlin. Her eyes welled up with tears and her entire body began to quiver in a way that couldn't be excused by the cold. Why you tricked me? I'm afraid we did, said Perlin, his head dropping lower. The Baron wished for me to pass on his congratulations for your success and that he has the highest hopes for your career as you finish out the remainder of your apprenticeship under Dame Rarity of Ponyville. He says that he is certain that you will be mindful of whom you owe for this marvelous opportunity. No, whispered Coco backing up slowly, shaking her head, no. A faint rattling noise froze her in place. The edge of Perlin's cloak pulled up slightly, bearing a tiny portion of his wing, the mithril feathers catching the light of a nearby street lamp. However, Perlin paused before he could even begin actually extending the wing. Turning his head, he glanced back at the appendage for a moment, seemingly deep in thought before relaxing, allowing the hem of the cloak to drop back down once again. He took a slow step back from Coco as he met her tearing eyes once again. I'm sorry, he said, his own voice almost a whisper. Perlin took another step back before spinning about and taking to the air with a flash of silvery metal, leaving Coco standing alone, dumbfounded, in the street. Slowly, Coco came back to her senses as the dread drained out of her. The instant she realized she was alone again, she turned and bolted, rushing down the streets. She didn't stop her headlong gallop for anything, not until she'd reached the door to her apartment and locked it behind her. Only then did she stop to catch her breath as she fell onto the couch. Only later would Coco realize that there had been some crucial differences in Perlin's demeanor when he'd been about to extend his wing, differences that gave the gesture a profoundly different meaning. However, at the moment, Coco's heart was too heavy to think about minutiae as she stretched out across the couch, still clad in her gala dress, and cried herself to sleep. The sun's rays were only just beginning to lighten the horizon when Don's eyes opened. He sprang from bed without the slightest preamble, his body already fully awake and his senses on alert. He was conditioned by long experience to being an early riser. However, this morning, it was not habit that awakened the ebony colt from his slumber. Don's wings extended and his senses swept through the room around him, seeking for any sign of threat. However, he found none. He began to wonder just what cue had awakened him so abruptly. His sleep had been untroubled, so it couldn't have been a nightmare or anything of the like. Rather, what he'd responded to had been a sense of familiarity, as though something very familiar to him was close, a familiar presence but not one that would pass through Don's vicinity without being noticed. Taking a deep breath, Don closed his eyes and relaxed his body, allowing his thoughts to drift away. Rather than actively reaching out with his senses, he instead allowed them all to fade away until his awareness hit upon the stimulus that had made him leap out of sleep. It was indeed a familiar presence but not one that Don liked being familiar with. He's close, thought Don. There was no question that it was his presence. Perlin Bluestreak was nearby. If Perlin was in the same vicinity as Don, there were precious few reasons he would be there. Don frowned. After the events of the past few days, he wasn't exactly in a fighting mood. Still, Don realized that Perlin wasn't likely to just leave because Don was uninterested in fighting at the moment. So, it was with a heavy heart that Don opened the windows to his room and leapt over the sill. He spread his wings and allowed his magic to push off the air beneath him, letting him soar up above the city of Canterlot beyond the palace walls. Don began to survey the area, looking for any sign of the older colt, prepared for an attack from any direction. It was an attack that never came. When Don's eyes finally found Perlin, the black-cloaked young stallion was simply standing on a random rooftop, staring blankly into the distance, as though he was completely unaware of Don's presence at all. Now that Don thought about it, there had been something off about Perlin's presence before. He now realized that while Perlin had been there, nothing about Perlin's presence had been directed at Don. It was completely void of intent but rather empty and aimless. Perlin didn't even react as Don swooped low over him. Only when the sound of Don's hooves hitting the rooftop reached his ears did Perlin respond. Oh, said Perlin, his hawk-like eyes barely even glancing at Don, it's you. He sighed and turned back to staring off in the distance. I know we're not exactly in a relationship where we can ignore one another. But just this once, could we pass on some kind of confrontation? I don't really feel like it today. Don stared. It was the only thing he could do really. Granted, his experience with Perlin was limited, but there wasn't all that much to learn about the nuances of Perlin Bluestreak's nature and attitude. More importantly, Don couldn't remember a time when Perlin, on at least some level, hadn't been spoiling for a fight. Even when they had ostensibly been allies during their journey to Diamond Mountain, there had been a subtle degree of provocation behind all of Perlin's words and actions during that event, as though he'd been trying to provoke Don into another fight even when they were supposed to be working together. Canting his head, Don watched quietly. It was true, there was no sign of animosity from Perlin. It seemed he really had no intention of fighting. If that was the case, then Don's sensing of his presence at all had been merely coincidental. Did something happen? Perlin extended one wing from beneath his cloak and turned to examine it sadly. You know, I've always been happy about these. They're the most amazing thing I've ever gotten from my father. I've always been excited by the prospect of getting to use them to their fullest to master their capabilities as weapons. But, he sighed and returned to staring blankly ahead, his wing once again disappearing beneath his cloak. For the first time, I truly regret having them. I feel as though they're keeping me from doing something important. Don gently bit the inside of his lip. He was uncertain of what to say, lacking the context behind Perlin's behavior. Did something happen? He repeated. Perlin turned his head again and looked back at Don. The older Colt looked tired was the only word that Don could find to describe him. He'd seen Perlin at the edge of exhaustion before, but this was a tiredness that seemed to have settled down over his soul itself. It seems silly to only realize it now, said Perlin, who started examining his wing again, but I've learned that, in order to acquire the power that I have now, I've had to give up something important. Don nodded. He could understand that. Perlin continued, and, whenever I think about it suddenly, fighting you just doesn't seem as important as it used to anymore. In other words, you found something more precious to you than your ability to fight, observed Don softly. His words made Perlin stiffen. There shouldn't be anything more important than that for me, muttered Perlin. All that I've ever needed was to make the fullest use of the gifts I've been given. I was raised to fight. It's the only thing I know. Clearly it isn't the only thing that matters to you now, replied Don. Perlin had nothing to say to that. I've always thought, said Don, that fighting for fighting's sake was an empty thing. In the end, it will bring you no fulfillment, regardless of which of us kills the other. Even if you win, even if you use everything that you have, I don't think you'll be happy when the dust settles. Then why do you fight? Asked Perlin. I thought you knew that already, replied Don. I fight because I want to protect my friends and loved ones, the ponies who've opened their hearts and homes to me. They are precious to me and I want to fight to hold on to that. Perhaps you are not feeling so enthusiastic because you are no longer confident in your reasons for fighting or the idea that fighting need be central to your existence. If that is the case, then you merely need examine what has changed, what you find that you value more. If you can, then your skills can be used in the service or protection of that which you value. I believe that is what will allow you to move past this. Perlin stared silently at Don, clearly uncertain what to say. Think about it, said Don. If you still feel the need to fight me, I will wait for you and we will settle this. But I believe your heart may lay elsewhere for now. He took to the air and made his way back in the direction of the palace. Perlin watched silently until Don became a black speck against the white walls. He examined his wing once again. I wanted to offer her a measure of comfort to try and help her to feel better. But with this wing, it would only hurt her worse. Almost any kind of physical contact between us would carry that risk. His mind drifted back to the offer his employer had made. At the time, Perlin had dismissed it almost automatically, being glad with what he had. But if his employer could fulfill the promises he had made, then maybe Perlin needed to reconsider his answer. After returning to his room, Don decided against going back to bed. He was already awake and trying to get any more sleep would only throw him off later on. Instead, he went about his usual routine. After cleaning himself up, Don went about the process of packing his belongings. It was nearly time for them to return to Ponyville after all. Once that had been taken care of, Don left his room and set off looking for a quiet place to train. He found the same empty room he'd been practicing in on Hearthswarming and once again began going through his forms. His early start allowed Don more time to practice before he had to join every pony else at breakfast, so he used the time to his advantage to get in some extra meditation. As he came out of his trance, Don became aware of the fact that he was no longer alone in the room. However, the pony watching him was not any pony he'd ever met before. Hello, said Don, looking into one of the room's shadowed corners. Good morning, replied the stallion, stepping into view. Don's eyes took in the details of the stallion's brown coat, his off-white mane and tail, as well as his glittering crimson eyes. However, the most interesting feature was the horn sprouting from the stallion's head, sheathed in the same off-white color as his mane. I apologize for not noticing you earlier, said Don. Did you need this room for something? Please don't apologize, said the stallion, giving Don a respectful bow. If anything, I should be apologizing to you for watching you during a private moment. There's nothing all that private about it, replied Don, eyeing the stallion carefully. Otherwise, I wouldn't be practicing in some random room if I required that no pony see it. True enough, replied the stallion. I must say, it's a pleasure to finally get to speak with you, Don Lightwing. You know who I am. The stallion chuckled dryly. I could scarcely not, he pointed out. You are the talk of the town after everything you've done. And, of course, ponies know what you look like thanks to that nice article about you in the news. I don't think I'm ever going to get used to that, muttered Don. It seems you have me at a disadvantage. May I ask your name? Of course, replied the stallion. My name is Whiteshade. Dame Twilight Sparkle is already acquainted with me. I happen to be the majordomo to Princess Luna. Is there something you needed? Asked Don, or did you just drop in to watch me? I was passing by on an errand, replied White with a sly smile, but I decided it would be worth my while to spend the time observing the colt that so many ponies are talking about. And, Don's eyes narrowed. White simply shrugged. I have to say, you're very impressive for some pony so young. You have a great deal of strength, in both body and spirit. It was worth it to get to see you in pony. Don shivered, feeling a strange, oily sensation wash over him. It wasn't an overt, tangible force but rather, something akin to intent. However, the motivations behind it were not something he could even begin to find the words to describe. It was as though the thoughts and feelings that Whiteshade was directing the colt's way came from a perspective that Don simply had no frame of reference that would allow him to interpret it. All Don could decide about the feeling was that he did not like it in the slightest. However, since there was nothing even remotely resembling hostility, he decided to let it pass. Whiteshade bowed politely to Don again. I am grateful that I had the chance to watch you in action. I'm afraid that I must take my leave now. I am certain that we will meet again. White turned and left through the door that Don had come through. The realization of his absence made Don shiver slightly as he realized that he'd never sensed White's presence before speaking to him. Either the strange stallion had already been in the room when Dawn had entered or he had come in while Dawn had been practicing, all without Dawn sensing him in the slightest. At first Dawn suspected that Whiteshade might have been a martial artist of some skill to be able to conceal his presence so completely. However, that didn't seem quite right. White's presence, when Dawn had been able to sense it, had been at once too normal and too other for the Colt to equate White to a martial artist. It was as though the stallion known as Whiteshade conformed to a different set of rules than any pony Dawn had ever met, as though there was something to him that was not quite of this world. That would make him, what? An alien. Dawn blinked and shook his head at the inherent silliness of the notion. Whiteshade was clearly a pony with an interesting condition, if his horn was anything to go by. But that did not make him an alien any more than Dawn's eyes made the Colt a demon. Perhaps I just imagined it. Not that White was gone, his previous presence and the impression Dawn had gotten from it seemed entirely too surreal to be anything more than the work of his imagination. Maybe I'm a little too out of sorts from meeting Perlin, thought Dawn as he went back to practicing in an attempt to fill up the time until breakfast. The group's remaining time in Canterlot was pleasant as they spent the rest of it enjoying their presence in each other's company. They mostly kept to the royal palace. However, Twilight Sparkle was all too happy to show her friends and the young ones her favorite places in town, including her favorite parts of the school for gifted unicorns, several favorite shops in town, some of her favorite places to eat, read, and otherwise hang out, and her parents' home. Nightlight and Velvet both especially enjoyed fawning over the foals, right before carefully and discreetly, by some measure of the term, ribbing Twilight about when she might consider having foals of her own. Sadly, Twilight's parents were much less interesting as a pair of potted bramble bushes, so the group's visit to Twilight Sparkle's Full Hood home ended up being a bit on the short side. They toured art galleries and museums, some of which were fascinating, some of which were rather dull, to most of the group anyway. Dawn took everything in with a quiet fascination, having never been to places like these before. Though the beauty and depth of many pieces of art eluded him, he had to admit that many of the paintings and sculptures were enthralling. The museum exhibits had been interesting to him as well, and he found that he enjoyed learning about topics that he would have never thought to explore otherwise. The only true sour note of the whole affair were the furtive looks and outright stares they seemed to attract everywhere they went. It wasn't every pony that was watching them. It wasn't even most of the ponies. However, no matter where they seemed to go, Dawn's alert senses could pick out the signs that eyes were following them, with varying degrees of intent, some less pleasant than others, though there was a distinct lack of outright hostility. Dawn was a bit surprised to note that the bulk of the covert observation did not fall on him, but rather on Twilight and her immediate circle of friends, including Dawn's adoptive mother. If anything, Dawn figured he was being regarded more as a distracting oddity than anything else, while Twilight and her friends, but especially Twilight, were the main attraction. The ponies doing the watching varied from place to place. Amongst the paintings of one of the art galleries, Dawn noted that a few of their observers seemed to be especially well dressed. On the streets, otherwise innocuous ponies seemed to slip amongst the crowds around their little group, moving carefully to keep them in sight while trying to keep themselves out of sight. The experience was similar to when they'd first arrived. However, now there is a great deal more tension in the air, at least there was more tension being exuded by the ponies watching the group. It was as though they were holding their breath in anticipation of something. Dawn decided to bring his observations to Arkenstone and see what the Knight of Dancing Blades made of this. You're aware that the nobility have their eyes on Twilight, correct? Inquired Arkenstone as they trailed behind Twilight, who was prancing giddily through the shelves of a bookstore. Dawn nodded. After all, that had been the whole reason behind the kerfuffle with Full Protective Services and his little John to Diamond Mountain to resolve the affair. What are they looking for? Asked Dawn. Arkenstone shrugged. Any number of things, weaknesses, opportunities, ideas, habits, inspirations, anything that they can use to try and bring Twilight Sparkle under their control. Amongst the ponies watching us, some are considering blackmail, if they can find the suitable means. Others are trying to determine what they want that they might be able to offer Twilight or her friends to earn some sort of accommodation from them. Some are looking for a more tangible weakness to exploit in order to attempt more direct methods. A few of the stallions, at least, are also looking for things they could use to woo Twilight should they try to convince her to become a consort to one of them. They are also watching each other. After all, whoever manages to gain some measure of control or influence over Twilight will gain a great deal of political power from the move, which would give that pony an advantage over the rest of the herd. So they are also trying to hold one another in check, even as they try to make opportunities for themselves. It's the main reason no one has actually tried anything yet. Whoever moves first will simply mark herself out as a target for her competitors. You mean like Sweetwater? Asked Dawn. Perlin had been the one to make Dawn aware of the actual forces at work behind the pressure that Full Protective Services had been exerting on him and his mother. However, Perlin had done that because he had been working at the behest of some pony who had wished to curb Sweetwater's ambitions and keep her from gaining the leverage she had been seeking. Arkenstone nodded. Yes, Twilight is safe for the moment given that she is in Canterlot at the behest of the princesses and that she has so many friends and family around her at the moment. It makes her difficult to approach. However, I expect that we will begin to see the repercussions of this attention later on, even after we are back in Ponyville. I see, mused Dawn, trying to think about what he could do to help. Twilight Sparkle was his friend after all. She had gone to great lengths and even put herself at risk in order to help him deal with the cult Solar. He owed it to her to protect her as best he could from this. However, this was a kind of battle that he was hopelessly unprepared to fight at the moment. Please don't concern yourself with this for now, said Arkenstone, smiling down at the colt. Your care is appreciated. However, you should remain focused on more pressing affairs. For the time being, think about protecting yourself first and foremost. I can attest that it would hurt Twilight a great deal if something bad happened to you because you were too focused on helping her. Dawn frowned. Tara Hart will be coming for you at some point, said Arkenstone in a low tone. If he's as dangerous as I expect he is, you will need every scrap of awareness and focus to survive. Protect yourself first and foremost. I think that you've learned that you can't afford to weigh your own life so lightly anymore. Thinking about the conversation he'd had with Scootaloo on Hart's warming morning before breakfast, Dawn swallowed and nodded. Good boy, said Arkenstone with a chuckle. Leave Twilight to me. I would sooner carve Canterlot from the side of the mountain before I allow anything to happen to her. The conviction in Arkenstone's voice made it practically hum with the power of his intent. Dawn shivered, not envying the fear that any pony would experience if they chanced to test Arkenstone's willingness to protect Twilight. As it turned out, the first move in the game being played with Twilight Sparkle as the prize was surprisingly straightforward. A note borne by a palace messenger was presented to Twilight as soon as she reached her quarters after returning from their whirlwind tour of Canterlot's points of interest. It was a surprisingly ostentatious approach given that said note was presented to her on the center of a silver tray suspended in the field of the servant's magic. After paying a bit to the servant for his work, Twilight took the note and held it in front of her. It was addressed simply and had been given to the messenger with instructions that it be delivered to her at the first convenient opportunity. Should I open it? Asked Twilight, turning to look at Arkenstone, who was sitting next to her. The stallion had been waiting patiently while Twilight regarded the note. That is up to you, replied Arkenstone. Are there any signs of immediate danger? Twilight's muzzle scrunched as they scrutinized the letter. No hostile magics, no traps or compulsions, just plain paper and ink. The horn writing is precise, clearly the work of some pony who's taken calligraphy lessons, probably one of the nobles, I'd bet. But there's no official seal and no instructions or requests that came along with the letter itself, so it's clearly informal. But what does that mean? What does all that say? Arkenstone pursed his lips. The best way to find out would be to read the letter itself. If it is informal, you may, of course, simply dispose of it. That would be impolite, but it would not be the grievous insult to the sender that it would be if it were a formal missive. Chewing the inside of her lip, Twilight thought the matter over. If she disposed of the letter, then it wouldn't matter what the sender had to say. Her refusal to even read it would be answer enough to whatever questions of requests he or she might make. However, that would also leave nothing for Twilight. Some pony was behind this and that pony was clearly up to something. By reading the letter, then perhaps Twilight could glean just what that something was and perhaps benefit from that knowledge. The envelope opened and Twilight pulled the letter out, unfolding it so that she could read the document in its entirety. It was brief and to the point. Dear Dame Twilight Sparkle. I am writing this letter in hopes that I might solicit the opportunity to speak with you at some point in the near future. I understand that this request will be reviewed with no small measure of suspicion, and rightly so. I fully understand that your situation has left you guarded with regards to the requests and solicitations of those of noble rank, such as myself. With that said, however, please allow me to assure you that conversation is all that I seek with you. I require no other concessions of place or time, save that it be sooner, rather than later. I wish to speak to you of affairs that are of great importance to this nation's future and are critical for the continued prosperity and survival of Equestria as a whole. Thus, I appeal to your desire to help and protect your fellow ponies from potential harm and hope that a discussion between us could lead to the guidance of Equestria's future in a positive direction. Once again, conversation is all that I seek from you at this point, and anything further would be by your informed consent alone. I am aware that right now is not an appropriate time for such a conversation and that you have no wish to immerse yourself in political affairs in the course of this season as you spend time with your friends and family. I also do not require that our conversation be held here in Canterlot. I am willing to meet with you in Ponyville at a time of your convenience. Once again, sooner would be better to hold a civil discussion with you. Please understand that this is an informal request I am making of you. You are under no obligation to agree or even respond to this request. If you have at least read this letter, then I am grateful for your indulgence. That said, I do hope that you will at least consider my humble request and grant me audience when and where it suits you. Sincerely, Baron Elderflower of Dream Valley. Twilight hoofed the letter over to Arkenstone, who ran his frog across the page and feeling its words through the sensitive pad of his hoof. It's certainly an innocuous request, replied Arkenstone. I'm rather surprised at this Baron's degree of restraint and that he's willing to keep from placing undue pressure on you to agree to his request. But why? Mused Twilight. What does it mean? Hummed Arkenstone. I'm reminded of something Stormfront once brought up to me. What's that? The concept of the negative conversation, explained Arkenstone, as he once put it to me. There are two critical parts to any conversation. There is what is said. He waved the letter. And then, there is what is unsaid, which can be of equal or even greater importance. What's unsaid? Muttered Twilight. She turned her attention to the envelope. There's no seal. It was completely informal, but it wasn't secret. Baron Elderflower made no attempt to hide his identity from me or even any pony else who might be monitoring conventional lines of communication. In other words, he was not worried about whether or not you would read this, suggested Arkenstone, either because he felt that he understood your character well enough to believe that you would read the letter or because it would not be a critical blow to his plans if you refused to read it either. It also means that he's not concerned that any pony might know he's approached me, added Twilight. In other words, he's not worried that any pony is going to try to stop or interfere with whatever he's doing. Arkenstone nodded. That is an interesting point, he said. I don't like this, said Twilight. There's just not enough information, said or unsaid. I can't figure out what angle this stallion is working from, not without talking with him. But the only way to learn more would be to agree to his request and meet with him, said Arkenstone. We aren't equipped for any more clandestine investigation into the Baron's motivations. The most reliable way to find out would be to put the question to him directly. Yeah, said Twilight, once again chewing the inside of her lip anxiously. Her options were limited. On one hoof, she could discard the letter and the Baron's request, forget about it and move on. But it was clear that Elderflower's plan did not hinge on the letter or its request alone. Setting that aside would leave her in the dark as to what Elderflower was actually planning. But the alternative was agreeing to his request and meeting him for a conversation. About what, exactly? She wondered. Whatever it was, she was sure that, in spite of the Baron's assurances, that conversation was not the only thing he had in mind by talking to her. However, the only way she'd be able to gain an inkling of what he was up to would be to agree to that discussion and use the opportunity to ferret whatever information she could out of him in turn. I need to think about this, she said finally. I don't know what to do. Arkenstone lifted a hoof and rested it gently against Twilight's shoulder. Whatever you decide, I will be with you. I won't falter this time. He leaned in and nuzzled her cheek. You are my precious Twilight and I won't let you go. Warmth rose up in Twilight's chest at Arkenstone's words. Turning, she met his lips with hers. That's a promise, she said. Thank you. They leaned against one another, gently basking in their mutual warmth, which went a long way towards soothing Twilight's troubled thoughts brought upon by the letter, which rested harmlessly on a side table, set aside for later. On the last day that the group had in Canterlot, Twilight made her way down into the lower districts of the city, Arkenstone following her. Given that their train wouldn't be leaving until the afternoon, Twilight figured that she had more than enough time to make her final goodbye before she left. The fact that their luggage would be sent ahead to the station would only make things easier. When they arrived at the familiar townhouse, Twilight was not in the least surprised to see that absolutely nothing had changed since she'd last seen it. Certainly, the lawn out front was covered with a nice, heavy layer of snow. However, aside from the path shoveled through it to the door, there was no sign of the snow having been disturbed. With a sigh, Twilight went up to the door and knocked. "Hello," asked Trixie, leaning out the door. Her eyes widened when she saw Twilight waiting there. "Oh, Twilight, come in." Accepting Trixie's invitation, Twilight and Arkenstone knocked the snow off before stepping into the warm confines of the townhouse. Already, Twilight could hear rattling from the kitchen, where she assumed Arcana was cooking something. Her suspicions were confirmed when Arcana came trotting out carrying a tray of tea and some snacks in his magic. Following behind him was Sunset Shimmer, gasped Twilight, staring in shock at the orange mare as she trotted out of the kitchen after Arcana. "I'm surprised to find you still in Canterlot," noted Arkenstone, his ears turning in Sunset's direction. "You tend not to hang around for long." To Twilight's surprise, she saw a noticeable twitch run through Sunset for a moment. "I absolutely despise this city," she said plainly, "but Arcana and I had some arrangements to make before I left." "What sort of arrangements?" asked Twilight before freezing. "Oh, sorry, I probably shouldn't ask about stuff like that." "It's nothing particularly private," said Arcana simply. "We were discussing Trixie's position." "Trixie?" Twilight turned to the showmare, who had stars dancing in her eyes. "Dame Sunset Shimmer has offered to take me on and train me in the still way." "Isn't it wonderful?" exclaimed Trixie, looking as though she were about to faint with happiness. "It's so rare for a student of the still way to get training directly from another practitioner. This is a spectacular opportunity." "Training?" Twilight blinked and turned to look at Sunset again. "You're going to teach her?" "In so much as I can," replied Sunset with a shrug. "She doesn't lack for commitment. That's for sure. No pony would go so far as to put the seal on if they weren't going to see this through to the end." "Seal?" asked Twilight. "Show her," said Arcana. Trixie raised a hoof and brushed the strands of her mane clear, showing the base of her horn plainly. Twilight noticed a black band running around the horn's base. "That's why you can't use your magic. It's been sealed." Trixie nodded and let her mane fall back into place. "That seal is even more than that," replied Sunset Shimmer. "Not all who attempt the still way are willing to risk applying that seal to their horns." "Why is that?" asked Twilight. "Because it is permanent," replied Sunset. "Permanent?" Sunset nodded, her expression grave. "If Trixie does not master the still way, she will never be able to use her magic again. The only condition under which that seal can be removed is if the fundamental nature of how she channels and shapes her magic changes. In order to do that, she will have to abandon everything she has previously learned. By taking that mark on, she has blocked herself from the path of a regular unicorn for the rest of her life." Twilight stared at Trixie. "Are you sure about this?" "I am," said Trixie. "I could not have made this decision otherwise. I thought very long and hard about it. I came to the conclusion that, if I wanted to learn the still way, this would be the only way that I could." "You mean that seal isn't necessary?" demanded Twilight. "Of course not," replied Sunset. "After all, the essence of the still way is based entirely upon changing the way you understand your own magic.